Now the time is 7 p.m. I'd like to call the Policy and Services Committee meeting, regular meeting to order. So can the clerk please take roll?
Recording in progress.
Chair Tanaka,
Here.
Councilmember Lowing,
Here.
Councilmember Vinker. Here. 3 present. Thank you.
Okay, are there any public comment?
Chair, there's no request to speak.
Okay, so we'll close public comment and move to the action items. The first action item is approval of Office of City Auditor, fiscal year 2024 task order, CEQA status not a project. Does staff or the auditor have a presentation or anything they would like to say?
Thank you. Sorry for the delay. Good evening. Chantel Cotton-Gaze, Deputy City Manager. I'm looking on the Zoom and I don't see the auditor present, so I will message her.
Okay, so maybe should we reorder the agenda and maybe we'll do action item 2 first? Is that something we could do, staff?
I think that's fine. Mr. Lee? I don't see her on either. Give us 1 second.
If not, maybe we'll do item 3 first.
Mr. Chair, if you can give us a moment, we are messaging all appropriate staff for all 3 items.
Okay, city auditor.
The auditor just joined,
Okay, great.
so we can start with item 1 and then we'll have staff ready for item 2, if that's okay with you, Mr. Chair.
Sure, let's do that. Yeah. See, auditor, we're on item 1. We're ready for you to, is there anything you'd like to present or talk about so that we can discuss the item?
Yes, we have a few task orders that we're seeking for approval that are representative of the fiscal year 2024.
Okay, do you want to introduce them?
Yes, are we going to have the packet or the items themselves projected?
Yeah, can the clerk please do that? Or maybe enable the auditor to share her screen so she can go through that. Clerk, are you able to bring it up for us? Or see, auditor, do you want to share your screen?
Oh, okay, he has it. Okay, the 5 items themselves would be the FY 2024 citywide risk assessment, followed by the annual audit plan, the hiring of the external auditor, the administrative task for various reporting and city hotline, as well as the evaluation and benchmarking relative to the internal audit function's performance. Next page, please. We can proceed further. The risk assessment, as you know, is an annual process wherein we interview members of the ELT as well as council members to identify any elements of concerns or risks that may be called to their attention. We also consider any emerging risks just within the environment itself, as well as any previous audit results that may have an impact on the city overall. We can go to the next page. And so in conducting that risk assessment, the ultimate purpose of that is to develop and propose an annual audit plan to the committee and to the council for approval, such that the internal audit office would proceed with conducting those audits throughout the course of the fiscal year. We can move to attachment C.
I'm sorry, which one is attachment C? Is it this one?
The external auditor. I'm thinking you have to scroll up to task order number 3. Just to speak for this. As you know, we have an external auditor performing annual audit reviews, and that particular function actually rolls into the internal auditor's office. We actually collaborate on the activities that are being conducted. I participate in status meetings from that firm throughout the course of their work. They also collaborate with me in terms of what is going to be included within the annual audit plan, such that we, between those two entities, we can ensure that all of the risks that are known to us, as well as financial reporting, are accurate and complete, as well as timely. We can move to task 4. Task 4 involves various reporting and city hotline. The city hotline would be the complaint hotline that the city has available to the public as well as employees. The various reporting content relates to quarterly reporting on statuses of audits. Also, project management to ensure that those audits are presented to all of you, and any other items that might be periodic, such as a quarterly reporting of follow-up for any findings that have been reported, as well as a monitoring of management remediation action. And then task 5. This evaluation and benchmarking pertains to a peer review of the city auditor function. Per our contract, we mentioned that the Association of Local Government Auditors would be solicited to perform this peer review. We did make contact with them last year, I believe, and they always conduct their reviews on a 3-year basis. And so at the end of this fiscal year, that would be the time where they would have the relevant information needed to perform a peer review on internal audit activities. And so this task order is for the purpose of preparing for that review and then communicating with that entity when the time comes.
I forgot to mention to my colleagues, but as she goes through this, feel free to ask questions so that we have we could kind of keep the thread going. So if you have questions on this or prior ones, feel free to ask questions. So yeah, go ahead if you need to.
Were you done?
Yes,
Okay.
that is all the task orders, yes.
I did have a couple questions on this last task order. 2 or 3 questions. I didn't quite understand sort of the overall. Was this a direction from prior council to do this peer review, or was this something you suggested?
This
And-
was part of our initial contract to
Okay.
have a periodic review of, an independent periodic review of the function. And so now the time has expired by which an external firm can be conferred with to perform that evaluation.
Okay,
And
and in your second to last paragraph, you say that this helps ensures that fees for service throughout the duration of the agreement are objectively determined, and its effectiveness of services provided by the consultant. So it seems very specific to the individual that's assigned, or individuals. Is that right?
it would be specific to Baker Tilly services, yes.
And you just mentioned 3 years, but the text said 2. Is that, are you saying it's shifting to 3 or no?
It is shifting to 3 because the firm does not conduct reviews any sooner than a 3-year interval.
Okay.
So we will be contacting that professional organization to determine who their resources are for conducting that review and then scheduling that to occur.
And in the lists of things that you do for cities,
This is a normal review. In fact, Baker Tilly conducts peer reviews for other entities. So this is a typical evaluation within the internal audit profession.
okay. And then the other question on any of these is about the hotline. What is it that you're actually auditing there? Response times and so on?
We would be responding to any calls that were made to that particular phone number
Oh,
and following up on those.
okay. You're actually following up on the complaints. You're not monitoring a city employee that's doing that.
No, it's a direct line that we have access to.
Okay.
And so if any messages are left there, we would be listening to those and responding to those.
Okay. We haven't quite got to this yet, but it looks like in this section, we're not tonight going to be recommending any budgets.
The recommended budgets are actually included.
Yeah, they are, but
Within the text.
it seemed to me that we weren't going to actually make a recommendation on that tonight. So I was trying to get clarity on that.
Well, the related budgets for each of those tasks is already incorporated into the contract for the year, for the fiscal year of 2024. So this is an acknowledgement of the use of that annual amount of funds pertaining to these 5 topics. And so as we go on with a risk assessment and an internal audit plan, there would be other audits specifically that would be conducted based on that annual amount for the contract.
Okay. That's all I have.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just had one question, which is a follow-up to the council member Lowing asked about the hotline. I didn't know there was one, and I'd just like to understand more about it because in the report, it talks about, or it says an employee hotline function, but you mentioned the public can also call. So what is this? How do people learn about it? What's the scope? Could you just tell me a little more about it?
The scope, this is typical for not just public sector entities, but corporations and all fashions of businesses and organizations where a particular phone number, or it could be an email, just depending on how the organization would like to establish that, is set up for the purpose of anyone that would like to report what they believe is something that is inappropriate, or perhaps service that they received that was not acceptable to them. It could be vendors may have some situation that they would like to report where related to their interactions with employees. So it's an independent place for things to be recorded there and then followed up on. And that typically is followed up on by an independent party of the employees of an organization.
Thank you. I'm just trying to get a little better understanding or grasp of the scope. So is it combination of an internal HR hotline if you feel you're being harassed or abused or something, and also if a vendor feels like they're being inappropriately dealt with, and also if somebody thinks there's some malfeasance? I mean, what's the scope of the?
All of those would be reasons that a hotline would be established, because the purpose is to have a place where anonymity can occur to the extent possible, as well as ensuring that any individuals that may be involved in whatever that dissatisfaction is are not the ones who are responding to the individual that is attempting to make a report.
Right, okay.
So that is the reason why you typically see those hotlines, or they're either reporting to an internal auditor or perhaps an ethics officer. In some cases, the legal department. It's just where the organization would like to place that particular function.
Okay,
So in this case, it's within the auditor's office.
okay. I was just unfamiliar with the pairing of internal complaints and external complaints, but that's, I think,
Be deposited there.
okay. Thank you.
If I might, committee member, council member, might be worth noting a little more clarification as it relates to our hotline. It really is focused internally. We refer to it, and it's actually called the Fraud, Waste, and Abuse Hotline. And actually, the system we use has actually 3 points of contact, or 3 somewhat checks and balances points of contact. The city auditor is one, the city attorney, and the city manager. We use a software platform that allows complaints to be received and that anonymity retained. And depending on, and each of us gets an initial read of a complaint. And then based on the nature of the issue, one or more of us may no longer be involved with it if follow-up is necessary, or to your point, there may be HR issues that come into play.
Quick question for the auditor. So if you were to compare kind of like our expenses here that you're proposing for these task orders versus, let's say, what we did last year, how would the dollars compare as a percentage basis?
These are essentially the same amounts. In the case of the risk assessment, there was an option to perform a comprehensive risk assessment on alternate years with something less involved, more of an update to the risk assessment. And so next year, what would be proposed is a lesser review than what we're doing right now.
Okay, so dollar amounts, there's no percentage increase from last year, is what you're
No.
saying? Okay,
No.
great. Does my colleagues have any other questions, or would anyone be willing to make a motion on this? Yep.
Yeah, I'll move the approval of the task orders identified in tonight's staff report. Tasks 1 through 6.
Second.
Okay, can the clerk please call roll?
Councilmember Lowing,
Yes.
Chair Tanaka,
Yes?
Councilmember Vinker,
Yes,
the motion carries 3-0.
I just forgot. We forgot to take public comment. Is there any public comment on this at all?
There's no request to speak.
Okay, awesome. Okay, good. We're closing public comment. Okay, so let's go to item 2. Does staff have a presentation on this?
Good evening, Chair and committee members. Jonathan Late, Director for Planning and Development Services, here with George Hoyt, our Chief Building Official, and on Zoom, reintroducing for the first time in a public forum, Rachel Tanner, who is working with our department to help us out on some various projects. So Ms. Tanner, if you don't mind, you can run with the presentation.
Great. And just want to check that everyone can hear me all right in the chambers.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. And thank you, Mr. Nguyen, for handling the slides this evening. And good evening, council members, committee members. Good to be with you and to see some of you again and meet some of you for the first time. As Director Late said, we are here to talk about the seismic hazards identification ordinance update with you all, and have, well, I have George here and I have Jonathan here. Who we don't have are the wonderful consultant team that put together the report and all of the research that helped to buttress what we're going to say today. So we will do our best to answer all of your questions, but just to say we don't have their expertise, as this report, as you may have noted, was finished in 2016, published in 2017, and now is making its prime time debut today. One of the things to note also is that while some time has passed since the time this report, the study, the seismic hazard risk assessment study, was published, a number of things happened internally in the city, as we noted in the staff report, and also globally and in the world between that time and now. We got a new city manager. We had internal changes within the planning and development services, which used to be planning and community environment, and development services became one department. We had the COVID-19 pandemic and the associated budget reductions for different items in city government, including our department. And now we're able to bring back this item as we have funds appropriated to move it forward. So very excited to introduce it to you all this evening. If we can go to the next slide. And so what we're going to be doing today is talking first a little bit about the what. What is the seismic hazard identification ordinance update, including a little bit about the actual ordinance that we have right now. Why is the project being undertaken? We want to go into what's the underlying kind of motivation for the project. How has the city approached this project in the past, and how might we approach this project going forward? Next slide. And we hope that we can focus on discussing with you all questions that you may have, providing the answers to the degree that we're able to, as well as really understanding if staff are headed in the right direction today. Are we kind of going in the right mode? Are there things that you are concerned about? And if there's any initial reflections you have about the policy choices that are presented in the report. Next slide. And so we'll begin just talking about what is the seismic hazard identification ordinance update project? Where exactly is this, and what are we planning to do? Next.
Rachel, just to kind of set the table here, like with the last agenda item, if my colleagues, you guys have questions that she presents, I would like to let my colleagues and myself ask questions so we keep the context. So we may interrupt you as needed. Okay.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And if I miss a hand or something, please do just say your question, and then I may be able to see who's speaking. So we'll appreciate that. So just a little bit of kind of background history. In 2017, the City Council gave the staff the direction to return to the Policy and Services Committee with amendments to the municipal code for the regulation of seismically vulnerable buildings. This was, again, following the seismic hazards risk assessment study, which is the many page report that you read, of which there were actually many more pages that we could have shared, and other appendices and documents associated with the work of the consultant team. That 2017 direction from council was building on 2014 direction from council following seismic events in California, I believe an earthquake in Napa and elsewhere, that kind of led to a conversation around what are the risks here in Palo Alto. And back in 1986, the city had adopted, and still has adopted as part of our code, the seismic hazards identification program. And it's codified in Palo Alto Municipal Code section 16.42.2. And this ordinance established a mandatory evaluation program and incentives for property owners to voluntarily upgrade structurally deficient buildings. And those parts are bolded because those are key kind of program elements of the current program that could continue or that could change in the future. Again, that it's a mandatory evaluation, which means the building owners have to have an evaluation to see kind of what condition their building is. There are incentives to encourage folks to upgrade structurally deficient buildings, but they're not mandated to do so. Next slide. And so in 2023 and then the last fiscal year and this fiscal year, funds were appropriated by this council and by a previous council, totaling $225,000 for updating the ordinance. And so we can procure consultant help to assist with this project. And again, earlier this year, the council identified this seismic ordinance update as part of the community health and safety priority, further nested on investing in reliable, safe infrastructure and systems. Next. And so now we want to get into a little bit about kind of the what of what will we be updating. Great. And so when we think about kind of what is happening with the current program, of which 100% of those property owners complied with submitting the reports. Again, that screening and evaluation portion. Of those, 74%, and this is at the time in 2017, of the identified buildings were strengthened, demolished, or proposed to be demolished. And we did a little bit of digging in preparation for this hearing, and there are a number of other buildings. We were able to identify at least 6 additional buildings since the last few years that have also taken efforts to strengthen or plans to demolish seismically unsafe or challenged buildings. So it continues to bear fruit even in 2023. This ordinance covered 3 building types. You can see categories 1, 2, and 3 on the left side of the table at the bottom of the screen. You can see their building type, unreinforced masonry, and then also type 1 and 3 construction of any type. The construction date is also often an important marker and is so here, when were the buildings constructed, and then occupants, so the number of folks who can be inside of the building, and then the size of the building can be other dynamics and other factors that indicate if a building is subject to the ordinance. And you can see that it's occupants of over 6 plus 1,900 square feet, over 100 occupants, and over 300 occupants are the buildings that are applicable for the current ordinance. Next slide. And so when the study kind of looked at kind of where we are as a city overall, some of the big conclusions of kind of, again, what is it that we need to do as a city, that Palo Alto does face significant losses in the event of a seismic activity, and potential benefits from retrofitting are also significant. So while there could be great challenges in an earthquake, we also can do something about it. And the activities we can take to retrofit can actually make a difference in our safety and kind of preventing loss and helping us to recover more quickly as a city. We can also address known potentially hazardous building types that are present in large numbers in order to maximize the risk reduction. Next slide. And so we're looking at some of the additional building types. So you saw in that slide that there are 3 building types and categories that were included in the current ordinance. And so the study looked at adding 5 additional building types that could be included in an updated ordinance. And the picture to the right is a category 4, wood frame soft story building. That's one of the additional types that was considered in the study. And so again, you see here type 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 that were considered as part of the study. You can see the approximate number of buildings that are believed to be in the city of each type. And again, you can read in the study, there were a number of methods used to try to identify those. And we have a slide later that shows that. The building type, again, the date of construction, and again, the occupants and size that were considered for considering if we should add these to the ordinance. Next. And so kind of how would adding these different building types possibly help the city with its resiliency and its recovery? So during a seismic event, by upgrading or retrofitting these buildings, we could prevent or decrease the loss of life for folks who may be inside any of these buildings and during an earthquake, and also prevent or decrease the loss of property and damage to property. That helps to make sure that in the immediate aftermath of an earthquake, that there are more buildings that are occupiable, that are functioning, and also speed the overall recovery of the community, because we have buildings that can continue to perform their functions or even be used to perform a different function responding to the emergency. And the quicker we can get back to normal as a community, the quicker we can recover overall from a disaster. Next. And so some of the factors, again, that kind of go into thinking about what buildings could be considered are the type of construction, ones that we know have seismic vulnerabilities, how many occupants can be inside of the building. Ownership is another element that we'll be considering. Should we include condominiums? There are some challenges in some cases with the ownership structure for condominiums, but that could be something that we solve through development of the new ordinance to help condo owners and condo buildings also be safe. And then risk reduction and cost, again, balancing the cost of the retrofit with any incentives that we might offer as a city to those who are undertaking retrofitting, with the risk reduction and kind of the resilience and recovery aspects that are provided by undertaking those retrofits. Is kind of show a little bit of the modeling that was done as part of the study. You can see a magnitude 7.9 on the left and a magnitude 6.7 earthquake. You can see City Hall is located there to give a sense of kind of where things are in that outline of the city of Palo Alto. And so they used a system, the HAZES multi-hazard loss estimation technology, to really understand kind of in these types of events, what kind of damage might we expect in the city. And just to note that a magnitude 6.7 is a plausible event, and a magnitude 7.9 is a much larger event, but the 6.7 is certainly plausible, 7.9 a more severe event, but could certainly happen here in California and in Palo Alto. Next.
Ms. Tanner?
Oh, yes.
Before you
Yes.
go, can we go back to that slide?
Yeah.
Just because I'm having trouble reading the legend a little bit. Could you tell me, just tell me a little bit more about the colors in the legend and why the red stripe down the middle?
So again, not an expert, but I believe that is the closest to the fault line. And so that's kind of the center of the quaking and the shaking. And so that this is modeling kind of the shaking. And you can see that further out from the red is, less shaking, but certainly still subject to damage from the earthquake.
And I see City Hall. So is that Palo Alto, or how? It's just hard to see how much that covers. Do we know?
So the outline there in kind of a brownish color is the outline of the boundaries of the city.
Mm-hmm.
And then City Hall is just to show kind of a sense of where things are in relation to that, kind of as a marker of that City Hall. So you can imagine where the other parts of City Hall of the city are laid out in orientation to that. And then I don't know if that helps answer that question.
It does. Thanks very much.
Okay, great. George, did you have anything to add to that? I don't know if you had any additional information about the image.
Good evening, council members. George Hoyt, Chief Building Official for the City of Palo Alto. Yes, this model was done based off the San Andreas Peninsula fault at these two areas. So as you can see, the major earth movement would be closer to the fault. And as the colors turn to more of yellow and green, that's where we're seeing less vibration. So obviously in the foothill areas, we would see more movement than we would out towards the actual center of the city.
Great. Thanks, George.
Just
go to that.
again, because I'm having a little, the numbers are small and my eyes aren't that great. So City Hall looks to be sort of on the verge of the yellow and the green. So roughly what's the magnitude by the time it gets that far? Just
You'll have to excuse me.
I know it's hard to read.
I forget what G stands for, but it's the seconds. What those numbers are indicating is the seconds of spectacle acceleration. So basically, how quickly is the ground moving? I believe. Go ahead.
Spectacle celebration.
Yep.
Wow.
And so I think in this case, it's showing, at the 7.9 magnitude at City Hall, it could experience 0.60 Gs. And on the 6.7, it's 0.48 Gs.
And I don't know that the image or the legend is much bigger, but it is on packet page 47. I'm not sure if you have a better view on that packet page. The legend, I think, is just generally pretty small in this diagram.
This is sufficient. Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course. If we can go to the next slide. Great. And so then this is kind of showing, again, kind of really just understanding what are the losses that we could expect in those two types of events. And so again, the magnitude 7.9 scenario, $2.4 billion in losses, the magnitude 6.7 up to 1.2 billion. So I think an important point here is that even though as the magnitude of the earthquake obviously increases, the amount of loss really significantly increases. In fact, it nearly doubles going from the 6.7 to the 7.9. So pretty severe. Next slide. And then when we look at kind of the loss, that reduction via retrofitting, again, we still see that but the reduction in total loss, can we go back just one? Great, thank you. The reduction in total loss of a 45% reduction for the 7.9 and a 33% reduction for the 6.7. So again, to show that by retrofitting, we can actually make a significant difference in the amount of loss that occurs, and that aggregate loss could be reduced almost by 1/3 and almost halved for the 7.9. So, and then again, the reduction of the number of buildings with more than 20% damage also improves, which is pretty significant and a good sign. Next slide. And then so about representing about 15% of the total building inventory are these 4 building types. They're responsible for 30% of the total loss. So even though they're just a small fraction of the overall number of buildings, the loss in these buildings is great, again, because they're seismically vulnerable. And so if we retrofit this group, it could lead to 50% reduction in loss again. So kind of going to where we can make a big impact based on the construction type of the building.
Ms. Tanner, I have
Yes.
another question on this. So looking at those 4 model building types on the left, how does that compare to the categories 1 through 3 from before and the new categories in table 2?
So so this is not looking at the 1 through 3. So those are not in these 4 here. These would be 4, 5, 6, and 7. So throughout the ordering of the types, they should pretty much almost always be in that order of either 1 through 3 and then 4, 5, 6, and 7. So You're going to see the soft story, the tilt up, the soft story concrete, and the steel moment frame.
Okay, so then when you were looking at the losses as is a couple slides back, is that just based on damages to these 4 types of buildings or the prior 3 and these, or what?
So the losses, if we want to go back actually to the previous slide and actually go back one more. So both of these slides actually are looking at the total losses in the entire city through, again, using the HAZIS system, which is a modeling system for disasters like this. And so it's really looking at the total losses. And then kind of that third table is zooming in to say, of all the categories of buildings, though those 4 types of buildings are 15% of the overall building inventory, they are accounting for 30% of the loss. And so we can actually, they're kind of out of proportion, if you will, right, to how many their prevalence in the city, if that makes sense.
I see, yeah. So, and this is the overall, what we're looking at right now. And then that one is for those top ones that have double their number in impact. For
Exactly, yes.
Okay, got it,
exactly.
thank you.
Yeah, it's a lot of information for sure. So thank you for your great questions. I think we can go ahead maybe a couple slides. And one more. Great. So this is a kind of a little crazy slide that the consultants created because this is a little bit of the process that they went through to kind of further refine, because that system that we talked about, the HAZIS, is a modeling system, which is really great, but it's kind of looking at a very high level. And so there actually was a lot of work, and Chief Building Official Hoyt can talk more about this process as he was involved in it, but really they dug deep into kind of looking at the tax parcels of Palo Alto, which is on the right, that brown circle there. They consolidated parcels. They made sure to take out single family homes. They took out hospitals and public schools because they have their own regulations for seismic safety that they are subject to. And so that found about 2,600 buildings that were part of the study group. And then of those, you can see on the left side, some that are part of the current ordinance that maybe were demolished or addressed or remaining. And then of those not covered by the current ordinance, about 2,500. And then again, you can see them kind of spread out over those 5 construction types are here, with the other being on the rightmost side. And then you can kind of see how they further break down. Can they be retrofit? Are they soft story, their age, pre-Northridge, things like that. And then kind of getting to total additional buildings for a potential ordinance. On some field work, some looking at the ages of the buildings, the types of buildings, but we certainly didn't go inside and have an engineering report prepared for each building, but did want to get an order of magnitude of how many buildings, are we talking about that could be part of a future ordinance update. So I'm going to move on unless Chief Building Official Hoyt, did you have anything to add to this kind of procedure that went through? I know it was complex and multi-factored, but still, not necessarily as comprehensive as we may need in the future.
No, I think you did a fine job, but I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Mr. Hoyt, this is based on the 2014 work, is that, or?
Yes, that is the 15, 16. Yeah.
Okay, great. And that's really helpful to understand. But this pretty chart we're looking at doesn't then account for buildings in the last decade to the extent that do we have a sense if it would be roughly the same proportion or more of?
Well,
one,
I
less?
think the vulnerable stock would be the same because
Right.
new buildings are built under the new code. So they're much more, they would not apply to the vulnerable building categories. I would say that there are probably a handful or less than a handful of these buildings that have been retrofitted since then.
Sure. So the newer stock would be likely to the higher code, and so makes the vulnerability lesser percentage-wise than it would have been in 2014.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Go to the next slide, please. So then the kind of question becomes, that's what we could do and why we could do it, and then how might we go forward with this? Well, there are still many questions that need to be considered during the ordinance update and program design. You can see, and we'll go into a little detail soon, the consultants did a great job and the advisory committee did a great job kind of getting us to a certain point and certain level recommendations, including looking at factors like which buildings should we target? Should we expand to one or more types of buildings? If so, which ones? And what factors? Construction type, occupancy, age of building, should ownership or the use of the building be important? For example, might we care more about residential buildings where folks are sleeping at night than we may a warehouse? Conversely, a warehouse could have goods. And so in terms of recovery and resiliency, maybe ensuring that warehouses are seismically stable is really important to ensure that we can have movement of goods and supplies in the event of an earthquake. And what standard of retrofitting do we want the buildings to get to? Which requirements and which features should the program have? Could we expand voluntary? Should be mandatory? Should we add evaluations, mandating retrofitting? And then again, how to motivate and sustain progress. Those can be used like phasing and tiering, timing, and of course, enforcement. And there can be incentives to help encourage folks to move forward and to sustain the progress in actually retrofitting the buildings. So this update is going to require developing the policy, code changes, but also an accompanying implementation program that leads to the realization of the policy objectives. Especially depending on the way the program is set up, it will take energy and effort to both publicize and make sure folks are taking advantage of it, and possibly enforcement if that is part of the policy. Next slide. So we're going to go through 6 ordinance update approaches that the consultants and the program advisory group considered. And you can see highlighted in green kind of what each is adding, because each of the successive numbers kind of build on the prior one. So the first is no change. Just keep the ordinance that we have on the books. Don't do anything. That's not what the prior council directed us to do. And that is not what the advisory group wanted. They certainly said the status quo is not acceptable. Another way we could approach it, the next kind of ratcheting up, would be to increase the number of building types that are regulated. So going from categories 1, 2, and 3 to say 1, 2, 3, and 4, or 4 and 5 and 6. So adding more categories of structures and requiring mandatory evaluation. This is essentially the same program that we have right now, but more building types are required and mandated to at least evaluate the seismic safety of their buildings. The third option would be to increase the number of building types, but also add disclosure methods. So you can see here on the right, an earthquake warning sign. That is a sign that the city of Berkeley requires for buildings to kind of let folks know, hey, you're going into a building that may not be safe during an earthquake. And so that's a way to disclose to the public and occupants, potential buyers, and others that this building hasn't been upgraded. And that could motivate folks to make the changes. Next. Option 4 would be, again, increase the number of types, increase voluntary, but required retrofitting. That might be for some of the building types at a future time. So perhaps if your building is sold or if you're undergoing a substantial renovation, then you are required to do retrofitting at that time. Option 5 would be similar to option 4, but adding a fixed timeline. So you've got to retrofit within 4 years or 5 years or 10 years. And you're going to have enforcement if you don't retrofit by that time. And then option 6, required for additional categories. The retrofitting is required again on a fixed timeline, and this time for more categories of buildings. Next slide. And then this is kind of a slide that is showing the summary of recommended policy directions from the Seismic Risk Management Advisory Group. It's similar to the slides I was just showing. It just kind of shows it in a table format. And you can see, for example, if you look at the deadlines column and the voluntary triggered column, you can see that there might be, let's say for type 4 construction, that it could be a triggered or a mandatory requirement. And so it might be that in 2 to 4 years, a report is required, and that construction is triggered at sale or renovation, and that by 6 years out from the passage of the ordinance, folks are required to do it. So you've got a little bit of time where you can choose to do it. And then at some point we're saying, okay, you've got to actually make this update and make these renovations. And you can see on the right-hand column, the farthest right, potential incentives. So these were incentives that were thought of and considered at the time. We certainly would want to look at those again. And if there are any other incentives that could be used to get folks to voluntarily make that decision before they are mandated to make the upgrades. Next slide. And this is a graphic that's kind of representing some of the other cities and jurisdictions that the report looked at and kind of how their approaches and these options that are laid out on the other slides, options 1 through 6, with option 1 being the status quo, and kind of arranging on the left axis, you can see building types. So as you go lower, there are more building types that are included and fewer building types as you go up towards the top. Inventory only is on the left side of the other axis, and then strict mandates on the far right. And so you see you have some cities, like for example, the city of Fremont, where there were strict mandates, but it was not for that many buildings. So it was kind of there with fewer building types that were included, as opposed to, let's say, option 6, Los Angeles and San Francisco, which have strict mandates, lots of buildings that have to do it by a fixed timeline, and more building types are included in what must be upgraded and what must be retrofit. And so this is kind of looking at a range of cities. This is something we would want the consultants to take a look at as we restart, just to see if there are other cities that have programs worth looking at, and also to catch up on some cities, seeing how the unfolding of their programs has been going over the last 5 years. Next slide. And so our immediate next steps that we are proposing as staff and would love to get some feedback from you all tonight are going to be on the next slide. So our next step first is to procure expertise and have a limited refresh of the study. Most of it is pretty solid, still really good research. One of the things that we know we definitely want to update are some of the cost estimating to understand kind of the order of magnitude of how much are we thinking that some of the costs of these retrofits could be, so we can really understand what it is we may be asking building owners to do. 2, we want to establish the community engagement strategy and schedule. It was a very effective and robust strategy last time, and we certainly would probably revive a similar model and approach to community engagement and stakeholder engagement. 3rd, we would plan to, as we're working with stakeholders, working with our consultants, building on the policy, come back to this body and possibly from you to council to really get approval that our recommended policy and program are on the right track, and then use that feedback and then we'll kind of be off and running. So those are kind of our 5 proposed next steps. Next slide. Again, we look forward to getting more information from you as a committee, questions and answers you may have. Are we headed in the right direction? And there may be just some initial reflections you have based on some of the information you've seen today, or questions around some of these policy items. Next. And then again, this is here for your reference, the kind of where we left off with the advisory program and the recommendations from that body. And I believe that the last slide is just contact information and concludes the staff presentation for this evening.
Great, thank you for your work. The clerk, is there any public comment?
Chair, there's no request to speak.
Okay, I'm going to close public hearing on public comment. Does my colleagues have any questions, comments, thoughts about the presentation?
My overall thought was, I'm just thrilled that you've made the presentation. I think this is something we really need to grapple with. And I think it was an absolutely excellent presentation. So thank you for all the detail and answering my questions. And I thought it was really, really terrific. I do have a couple follow-up questions that will inform some of my answers on your last slide. So one is, when we look back historically, which thank you for that, the 1986 ordinance that kind of kicked it off, talks about the voluntary upgrade and the mandatory evaluation, the voluntary upgrade. How do we or can we get information about who did what? I mean, do we have those things on file somewhere? Because I know I've had a particular member of the public asking me about a particular couple of buildings that are prominent in town, and I can't seem to figure it out. So,
For example, to say, did this building that was on the list get retrofitted, kind of that type of information?
what is it made of? Was it evaluated? Did it get retrofitted?
I believe all those, well, I should say, 1986 was a little while ago. I don't know where the records are. They may be in Iron Mountain. But I do believe that we should have, and Mr. Hoyt can correct me, those records of the evaluations as well as any building permits that were issued in association with those upgrades. But I'm not sure if they've been digitized, if they would be in our online system.
Well, the good news is we do have the reports. They are in our development services operations in the filing cabinet in paper form.
There we go,
I
great.
will say over the years, a few of the reports may have disappeared. And so we may have to reach out to some building owners and find out some of that stuff. Also, historically, over the years, before I joined as the chief building official, we did not do a good job recording within our permitting system what seismic retrofit standard was used when buildings were retrofitted. We did discover that through this study in 2016-17. And one of the recommendations was that we do a better job recording that information, and moving forward, we have. So we do have that knowledge over the last 7-8 years. And I would say most of the buildings that were retrofitted previously from the 1986, a lot of the buildings were actually demolished and rebuilt to a new standard. So that was the preference back then. Since then, a lot of retrofit technologies have merged into the industry. And so that is another mechanism of which people are moving forward with.
Thank you. I think, there was a lot of increased recent concern after the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria, and over 50,000 dead, and the real tragedies that we saw there. And looking at those buildings, I mean, on average, and certainly the newer ones here, we're fortunate, are typically better, but some of those right, which I understand was primarily in buildings built before 1977, which I assume is part of why, on your charts it's referenced. But like when I look at the slide 11, the additional building types, we get down to type 8, where it says other older non-ductile concrete. It's a TBD, not recommended at this time, was in the summary chart. And the specific question, you may know this because these are prominent buildings, the answer to it. So if we look at 525 University Avenue, which was built in 1966 and appears to be concrete, Palo Alto Square that was built in 1972 and appears to be concrete. I have no idea if it's non-ductile, but do you know? Because if not, I would think we don't want to put them on the not recommended at this time list.
I will tell you that both of those were actually on the category 3 list, I believe.
Okay.
And because of their occupancy types. And the good news is we are just wrapping up a seismic upgrade on 525 University now. So they have strengthened that to a new standard.
Okay.
So that one is currently being retrofitted. The other property referenced has not proceeded with a seismic retrofit at this point in time.
But do we know what material it is? Is it not?
I believe it's non-ductile, possibly.
Okay.
Well, we don't really know because we haven't done it. I'd have to go back and look at the actual study, and I can get back to you on that.
Yeah, because
But we do have engineering studies from 1986
yeah,
on that building.
it's prominent. There's a lot of people in it every day. We guess far more than 300. So that's something where I think we should perhaps find, and that was one I couldn't find. So that's why I asked the prior question. Great. And then I'm really glad you included the chart about other cities at the end. And note that both Los Angeles and San Francisco are at the strict mandates for a lot of building types. And they have obviously a density of buildings. So I assume that no pun intended, but the ripple effect of one falling could be somewhat greater. But I don't know, do you have any background on why, that sort of the thought process those cities went through? Because I mean, they're large cities, they have a lot of resources, but obviously they also have budget issues. And they ended up with the strictest.
Yeah, I think part of it, just even thinking about kind of the summary of each of the cities that were looked at by the consultants and kind of what the paths were. I will say there's a bit of a focus, I think, on the city of Berkeley, maybe because there are some similarities between the city of Palo Alto and Berkeley, both in size and kind of building types, and kind of the diversity is similar. But for LA and San Francisco, I think certainly some of the things that you mentioned, very large cities, certainly lots of vulnerabilities. And I think as they're looking at kind of the numbers of their buildings and where they can have the most impact, that's kind of where they settled. I would say overall, it's a combination of, kind of the stakeholder appetite combined with the political will and the policymaker appetite for where we want to go. And then also what we think we're able to do to get there. And certainly we, myself and George, even visited folks in San Francisco to learn a little bit about what they did and kind of how they undertook it. And it certainly wasn't an easy effort by any means, quite a lot of work. And so some of it will depend on both the research, what that bears out, but also how the three of you combined with the other council members, what direction we want to go collectively as a city. And that also goes to, again, these variables, is it mandated or is it voluntary? And I think even our program and Berkeley's program had pretty significant uptake, even being voluntary, but requiring the screening or the evaluation. And so once folks know that they have a vulnerable building, there seems to be a pretty high incentive from the building owners to do something about the challenges. We've seen that here locally.
Good sense to me, and I think you are on the right track. Like I said, I'm thrilled you're doing this. I think reconstituting the what was it, the advisory board, I can't remember the name of the group. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I would lean toward 4, 5, 6 as options. Obviously, we have to learn a lot more, but I think that if we learn that things like Palo Alto Square are non-ductile concrete and have not been retrofitted, I'm not okay with just knowing that. I think that certain building types do need to be some mandatory retrofit, but obviously I don't know enough tonight to be able to do that. So I'm excited about this process starting up. And I think that's all I have for the moment, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. I agree that the presentation was excellent. Ms. Tanner, you passed your interview. I'm going to be one of your references and you're hired. Really good work as always. I've enjoyed working with you in the past and glad to have you back, at least virtually, here in Chambers. I have a few questions from my reading and also from your presentation. I'm delighted to hear that, as you say, the study remains very relevant and comprehensive. That's great. We don't have to restart. Coupled with that, it seems that we're going to say redo or restart or reconvene an advisory group. And I just kind of like to probe on the pluses and minuses of that. I mean, I know a little bit of the pluses as you get, new architects today looking at it. And one of the minuses is it could take 3 years for us to get it done. So just starting with that kind of range, do we have a feeling of what this thing's going to look like? Is it going to be the same as usual? Are we going to just tell them start from scratch or pick it up from here?
It's a great question. I think a couple things about the structure of the previous advisor group that made it very successful. One, they had pretty defined set of meetings. They knew they were going to have 6 meetings. It was a combination of the city staff and other local stakeholders. So you really had a great group of building owners, building professionals, folks on the public side as well, working together. And it was set up that we didn't need to reach a consensus. That part of the process was to get input from the many different stakeholders and try to combine that together. Now, incidentally, they did come up with a recommendation at the end and areas where they did have consensus as a group. And so it was, I think, remarkable to note that they were able to find areas and quite a considerable amount of areas of alignment, even though that wasn't necessarily the group's mandate. And then that led to that table that you see of kind of, here's the recommendations that they were able to get to. But even with that chart, and as comprehensive as it is, as we start to drill down into each item, we get more questions that need answers. So for example, George and I were talking today, okay, if let's say we want to do screening, well, what's on the screening form? What exactly do we need to look at? And how is it going to be effective? And that's where the consultant will help us both, what other cities' screening or evaluation forms have looked like, what kind of staff power does it take to actually read the evaluations when you get them in and know what to do with them. And then, okay, once folks have their evaluation and they fall into different tiers, what does that mean again for mandatory, voluntary, et cetera? So these become parts of the questions we need to look at. In particular, I think the advisory group, hearing from property owners, what type of incentives make it feasible, what kind of financing tools might be needed. Do they exist in the marketplace? Can we persuade folks to offer them in Palo Alto so that they can actually literally afford, right, and have a financial means to make the upgrade? So these are some of the details that I think we'll be getting into, but the group did get to a place of pretty high consensus, I would say, on some pretty significant milestones and kind of significant turning points of the policy direction.
If I had created a list of 50 options of answers to that question, I all in on that one. Really.
Well, they weren't setting out to get to consensus. They just happened to reach, I think, a pretty good group. So I don't know if it was magic or what, but the idea was that they didn't need to all agree, but
That's
that
great.
they could all provide input that would then be, presented to the public decision makers.
Yeah. Then back on the cost, one of the things I wrote down as you were speaking, which coincided with my reading, is I wrote down, mandatory retrofit equal, and then I wrote a lot of dollar signs. So it seems like it was very successful with incentive programs, and I'd be very suspicious if it wasn't less successful if we didn't have some significant ones. And those were pretty significant. Adding square footage and things like that is just major concessions. So I'm not suggesting at this point that that be one of them, but I'm saying if we just say, here's the mandatory retrofitting that you have to do, like San Francisco, LA, whatever, at the high end of that range, which was an excellent slide, by the way. Owners are going to scream because we need, as you said, Rachel, some financial tools or something, and we can't always just keep looking to the city to help finance private buildings for this. So I'm a little bit worried about legislating, a very extensive mandatory. I'm very interested in trying to find some incentives that don't require us writing checks, that's for sure. But I'm concerned that if we don't have some of that in place and it's not mandatory, then it might not get done. So I'm kind of stating all points on the scale. I just don't think it's easy to say we have to mandate it, and therefore you got to find the money to get this thing done, because look at how long Palo Alto Square has sat there, which is, a problem, right? One of the things I thought was interesting, I don't know if this earthquake warning sign on ordinance update approaches number, I think that's number 2. Number 3, additional disclosures. I think that's highly appealing because you're telling the public who's going to walk into that building, this might not be safe. That could be an incentive in itself for landlords. And that doesn't cost too much, because this sign that's cost on this building costs about 8 cents. This is really ugly, but that's good, because if they want to get that sign down, then you got to retrofit this thing. So I think there are some subtle ways that we can do that again are not writing checks. So let's see. What's the projected pace of this once we get started? Is this an X year project?
Well, we hope that it could be. We always hope it probably could be faster than it will end up being. But I do think we have a pretty significant amount of work that has been done to date. I think the initial project took to get to the study that we did, just the study period, I want to say was about 2 years. George, does that sound right? I know there was a bit of time of actually presenting the study to council, but I think it was about a 2-year process, give or take. So I think this could probably be somewhat similar or even more quick.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. I believe it was like a year and a half, and that included the RFP process at that time, and then bringing on the consultant, and about a year in the study, maybe a little bit over that. So
Yeah, I think it could
Similar.
be probably a similar timeline, I think, for this project.
Okay, and it seems like the data collection period is going to be relatively minimum because the buildings haven't changed that much.
That's true. And any new buildings, again, are built to newer code. And so most of the subject buildings already exist, right? The ones that are of concern.
Yeah, and I might just add, so I think when we get the RFP and the responses from consultants back, we'll have obviously some better insight into the amount of time. I mean, even the RFP process is going to take us the better part of the rest of this year to complete. So, I mean, we're still, I want to just set, but we'll need to see what kind of results we get from the consultants.
I was going to actually go slightly the other way because as we know, the planning department has a lot on the plate right now, and that keeps going up. I don't even know why you're here tonight, Jonathan. You should be resting up or working on housing somewhere. No, but seriously, we can't do everything, as always, as I say often to the city manager. And this is one of the things that is important, as are a lot of them. So I think we have to figure out the right pace with everything else that has to be done. And I know you have capable people to delegate this to, Jonathan, but money, time, and so on are part of the consideration. But overall, I think it's absolutely on the right track. And again, I think we're picking up a lot of resources from the past, and then kind of moving forward to the decision point. That examples from the other cities are very good because they're different from ours in some cases, and we can use that as comparison points. But I think, very, very thorough approach. Good work.
Great, thank you.
I just wanted to mention, Councilmember Lowing brought up financing, and I didn't address much of that one way or another, but I thought that the comment that I believe was made in the staff report about thinking hard about financing to ensure equitable application of whatever ordinance comes out of this, that it's not just the rich people who get the safe buildings or that landlords pass on too much of the burden to tenants. So then we have some other issues. I thought that was a wise observation and something that we really need to think hard about. And while the sign may be 8 cents, the retrofit is still as expensive as, whether you put the sign up or not. And what worries me is then, what if the person really needs the job in that building? They may not feel like they have a big choice. Or what if the housing stock has the sign is low income housing? Like I worry about that. I think we want to get a result one way or another. And financing is a real challenge. And so I don't want to minimize that at all. I think we have to think hard about it. I think we have to incentivize this, and I think we have to do it equitably. So these are big challenges. So we hope for the magic of the, agreement coming out of it with some smart results. It's a daunting challenge, but I think one that's just very, very important, as we've seen with the extreme loss of life recently in other countries. So again, thanks for bringing this forward.
Thank you.
So I might just on that comment note, as part of our, going through this process previously, development incentives are probably the most effective way to provide that incentive without the city having to expend, additional general fund dollars to support the initiative. So allowing for increased density without parking, additional, more units on a site, increases to height, so that the revenue stream could be, enhanced to help offset some costs. So we'll look at those options, and then we'll look to the council for guidance on how far those incentives need to go in order to provide that. And hopefully we can give you some kind of a, basic analysis of to justify why certain development incentives are being recommended to support. Thanks.
Okay, so yeah, just wanted to echo comments about, thank you for your report. It looks very comprehensive. Yeah, and also because we don't have that many, I think updating this shouldn't be a big deal because of the fact that these are older buildings. Here in terms of initial reflections or preferences. So I think it's important that we make sure that our buildings in our city are safe, and we do want to do it in a quick way. So I think having a fixed timeline is actually a good idea. We know that one day we're going to have an earthquake here, we're an earthquake country, so I think there's no mystery about that. So I prefer a fixed timeline, and preferably a fairly aggressive timeline. I think the idea of disclosure is actually a good idea as well, as long as it's not too burdensome. It's very easy to do. I think that's fine. I think in terms of mandatory versus voluntary, I think because I think I don't think we want to be pushing people out of the city, so I don't think we want to like cause a humongous amount of burden on landlords. So I think if there's any mandatory type of screening, evaluation, retrofit, I think we have to be somewhat sensitive so that it's not kind of unfair or makes it very difficult for some people to comply with. So I would tread very carefully there. I think voluntary is much better in general. And then in terms of building types, occupancies, I think we just have to be somewhat logical about it in terms of, if it's going to be used by a bunch of people and it's not very safe, we got to be careful, right? So I think we want to restrict that. And so, yeah, and so as the building is identified as being something that we should be concerned about, I think maybe the occupancy should be lower, or maybe there should be, I know they sell these desks which are like supposedly could, a whole concrete pillar could fall on and protect people. So like maybe some things like that, where if you can't retrofit, then you got to have like earthquake safe furniture or something on that order. Anyway, so I think some creativity there might be warranted. But I think the biggest one here in my mind is incentives. And I liked how you talked about TDRs, because I think it's not like it's going to be easy for the city to just suddenly come up with a bunch of money to say, okay, we're just going to fix all these buildings. I think if it was, we would have done it already, right? But it's not. And construction is only getting more expensive. And it seems like the only real way of doing this, and then kind of mandating that landlords do this, I think is also really hard because they may not have the money, right? You may be forcing, some widower to on the street if you're too heavy-handed. So I don't think we want to be too heavy-handed on this either. So I think the solution that we've been using, I think the solution that we have to use, and the solution that I think we should continue to use, and perhaps be a lot more aggressive about this, so that we're not 10 years from now the city council is not sitting here talking about this yet again, and that virtually all the buildings that we have in our city are taken care of, is really strong incentives. And I think we could do that through TDR. So you could give people the economic incentive to actually fix these problems. And I think we've been doing some of this already. So what's been I don't think this drilled into too much, but how's the success or not success of the TDR program? And what do you guys have any initial thoughts on what we could have done better, or what we could do to try to accelerate this process?
Well, I think, overall, for being a mandatory evaluation but voluntary retrofit, the amount of pace has been pretty significant. And I think I said 74%. And then even like I said, today, we were looking at an additional at least 7 buildings in the past 5 years that we would add to the list of those that have taken action based on their evaluation. And also it's pretty small universe of buildings. It was 89 total. So it wasn't, lots and lots and lots of buildings.
Mm-hmm.
I would note part of that is that with unreinforced masonry, there are some state level laws around those buildings being focused as well. So I think it's surprisingly successful for a voluntary retrofitting program. I would leave to George and maybe to Jonathan to talk a little bit about the use of the incentives that folks chose to use. But I do think, as Jonathan was mentioning, like having the additional floor area and being able to transfer development rights was pretty important to getting folks to take advantage of the voluntary part. I don't know, Jonathan or George, if you have any further comments on if there were some favorite incentives that people liked to take advantage of.
Yeah, thank you. I do think we need to explore a variety of options. Of course, the council members know that office is a big revenue generator, and when you have
was a big one.
well,
At one point.
at the time where these incentives were first originated or introduced into our zoning regulations, there was the opportunity for TDRs without parking, and that was a really big incentive downtown and in the SOFA area where historic or seismic upgrades were made to historic buildings or seismically vulnerable buildings. And that was there was almost a little submarket of TDRs trading and applying to properties. There was a policy decision in part to, I think, begin to address some of the office development downtown where the parking requirement was removed, or that was changed. And then any TDRs beyond that point in time needed to park that floor area on that other building. And that limited the scope of applicability for where those TDRs could be used, because you have limited opportunities to put parking on site, or you could buy into the in-lieu parking program, which had its own costs associated with it. So it wasn't as lucrative in that instance. I will note today, with the passage of AB 2097, the vast majority of our downtown area, because of its proximity to the University Caltrain station, does not need to provide parking for new commercial floor areas. So in essence, we've come back full circle to potentially TDRs being more valuable again.
Well, that's good news. I think the important thing is, because I think it's the responsibility of government to make sure that people are safe, and having known buildings that are earthquake hazards and having them persist while we know they're dangerous is not a good situation in my mind. So I think, from my perspective, I would love to see something very aggressive to try to wrap this up, and maybe some sort of deadline, like, hey, do it by this date, or incentive goes away, or something that's compelling. So I know staff needs to think about it. I think something along those lines would be good, so that one day when the big one does come, there's not a lot of people that get killed because of bad construction that we knew about, right? So because I think TDRs or something like that is the only thing I could think of that makes this pencil out, because I think everything else is it's not like we're going to raise a bunch of money. Not all landlords are rich, right? So it's not like they could just pay for themselves, and construction costs is only making this problem worse. And so I don't think there's much other choices that we have to enable this, because I think a lot of the easy ones have been done already. It's the ones that aren't done that are still a problem, right? And so I think, as you guys design something like this, it would be good to kind of come back to see, well, okay, if we do this kind of program, we think this many properties would remain unsafe, versus this kind of program, this many properties would remain unsafe, versus, some sort of elasticity analysis, right, on what's needed. And maybe 10 years even too long, maybe it's 5 years, I don't know, but something quick. I think we want to move on this quickly, because I think it's just a matter of time before we have a big earthquake here. Okay, does my colleagues have additional questions, comments, thoughts? Otherwise, maybe we'll close this item and move on to the next one. Okay, so it's 12.
Thanks again to all the staff on that. It was really good.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so it's 8:20. I propose we take a quick 5-minute break, and then we start again for the last item. Okay.
5 minutes.
Should I do it again? Let's go. Okay, does staff have a presentation they'd like to present?
Good evening again, Chantel Cotton Gaines, Deputy City Manager. The item that is before you today is a continuation of the referrals received from the City Council related to your Procedures and Protocols Handbook. As you will recall, we've discussed quite a few of them to date. And we have some items that we plan to bring you further language as refinements based off your discussions. And I think we have one left that we will further discuss with you. We'll just plan that out for later in the year. The item before you this evening for particular focus is related to the censure policy. Just to bring you up to speed of the discussion on this thus far is when this committee discussed the Procedures and Protocols Handbook in December of 2022. Staff presented some draft censure language as a consideration for the committee, and that language was pushed forward to the City Council as part of the larger discussion on the Procedures and Protocols Handbook. And the City Council felt like that language needed further refinement and provided some specific notes as feedback. So the City Attorney's Office has moved forward and drafted language, and that is what is in your packet today. And Ms. Molly Stump will walk you through specifics on that. Ms. Stump.
Great. I think the clerk's office, oh, there's the presentation. Wonderful. We have a short slide deck just to walk you through what we have prepared for your consideration tonight. All right, let's get started. Next slide. So as Ms. Cotton Gaines mentioned, this follows up on the City Council's referral, and council's expressed concerns. I think the minutes are quoted directly in the report, but to summarize, there was an interest in calibrating the potential council response to varying degrees of seriousness of conduct. There were questions about what might trigger an enforcement action, and there was stated concerns from a few council members to avoid any appearance or reality of politically motivated action. As Deputy City Manager Gaines mentioned, we did draft language as a starting point for your consideration. And what is before you tonight then is to discuss that draft. If we're totally off track, you can tell us that. Otherwise, a revised policy for council's consideration. Next slide. So what's in the draft policy? It proposes to add section 8.2, which would be called enforcement, to the Procedures and Protocols Handbook. This enforcement section would provide that the council could take action in response to one violation or repeated violations of written policies or law contained either in the handbook itself, in state or federal law, or in some other council-approved document. And the reason to refer to the touchstone of a written policy or law is to respond to that stated concern about perhaps undefined concerns that may be viewed as politically motivated. So this provides a touchstone of written policy or law. The draft policy includes a graduated menu of options and some points at which there are off-ramps in the process. And it includes procedures to ensure fair process for everyone, particularly for a council member whose conduct is of concern and is the subject of the matter. Next slide. So what's proposed is a multi-step process. It may seem on first reading to be a little bit complicated. The reason for it is to allow council to proceed in a step-by-step manner and resolve issues at whatever level is appropriate. So the initial idea is that the council discussion would be initiated, I should say initiated, by 2 or 3 council members through a colleague's memo. And the memo could propose a specific action, or it could simply just start a discussion about conduct that is of concern. The subject council member would have an opportunity to respond, and the item would be agendized for council, and council could take no action, could decide that what's appropriate under the circumstances is to clarify an existing policy or requirement, or to initiate a new one if there is a lack of clarity or a gap, and stop there. Council could issue an admonition, which is a very informal warning or reminder. Council could initiate an investigation if there are facts that need to be gathered. And the draft policy would suggest that an outside independent firm or individual would be the best, typically would be the best resource for that type of investigation, probably supervised by a council member or two appointed for that purpose. And then council could also agendize a formal disciplinary hearing. Next slide. So what would a formal disciplinary hearing look like? The subject council member would get notice and all the relevant materials. That person could be represented if they chose to. They, of course, could rebut all allegations, question accusers or people who have been identified with information of concern. They could offer additional written or oral material, but formal rules of evidence would not apply. This would be an informal opportunity for all relevant information to come out. And council, again, would have a series of options. Take no action, issue an admonition, direct that corrective action be taken by the council member involved, issue an informal reprimand, or if the clear and convincing evidence standard is met, which is more than a preponderance. So it's solid evidence, adopt a written resolution of censure. That really is kind of the ultimate action here would be a written censure resolution. There is a final slide, so we could turn to that one. Additional potential sanctions, but only in certain cases where they would perhaps be tied to the issue of concern or would be shown for particular reasons to be relevant. Could be removal from some committees or other assignments, or potentially restrictions on city-related travel. And I think that's the end of our presentation. We're open for questions or feedback from council.
Okay, first, are there any members of the public who wish to speak on this item?
Chair, we do have one request to speak. One
Okay,
moment, please.
can you give that person 3 minutes?
Our first speaker is Arthur Lieberman.
Good evening, council members. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
I applaud your efforts because it's important to have clear guidelines on ethical behavior so the public will support and have confidence in the council's conduct of the public's business. You're addressing tonight the enforcement section of the City Council Protocols and Procedures Handbook. This applies to the protocol's ethics addendum, the area that describes the recusal, when appropriate, of council members from acting on an item when there is a conflict of interest. The section E of the ethics addendum states members shall not use their official positions to influence decisions in which they have a material financial interest or where they have an organizational responsibility or personal relationships, which may give the appearance of a conflict of interest. Now, council members have been, as I have witnessed over the years, very careful to recuse themselves when they have a business or financial connection to a party connected with an issue before the council. However, a member of the city council has not been as careful when it comes to personal relationships. I will give you some details. First, some background. In 2006, a plume of nitric acid was released from CPI's recently rebuilt plating shop, which abuts homes on Chamalis Drive in Barrett Park. For 10 years, I led the neighborhood effort to find a resolution for the issue of having a plating shop storing and using large amounts of acids and cyanide compounds so close to residents. I work with City of Palo Alto consultants, Stanford Real Estate, the fire department, the planning department, and county hazardous materials officials. This effort involved many appearances by me and other neighbors before the city council. In 2016, the council approved and CPI signed an amortization agreement. Now, Council Member Pat Burt, the member that I want to talk about tonight, was on the city council during this time, including time as mayor. Pat Burt had many conflicts of interest, but he never recused himself. Pat Burt submitted a bid on rebuilding the plating shop. Pat Burt was a friend and professional associate of Jim Miley, a consultant for CPI, who redesigned the CPI plating shop. Jim Miley and Pat Burt wrote articles together and co-authored a book. Pat Burt was the president, and until 2010, of a plating company, and he was a past president of the Metal Finishing Association of Northern California. Pat Burt had a personal relationship with Bob Fickett, who was at that time the CPA president and is now CPI CEO, who was a friend of his brother-in-law. Pat Burt never recused himself. I don't know if he discussed these conflict of interest issues with the city attorney. I admire his leadership, his public service for the citizens, and his advocacy for sustainability. But with the issue of dealing with CPI, he made a serious mistake, an ethical lapse, by not recusing himself. So let me ask you, what will you do next time a citizen like me brings an issue like this one that I described and before you? Thank you.
Chair, that concludes public comments for this item.
Okay, thank you to the people that spoke. So we're going to close the public hearing, and I'd like to bring it back to my colleagues. And just to kind of maybe organize our thoughts. Go issue by issue to address it. So we have kind of a logical way of going through this. I did ask the clerk to see if they could bring up like a little Google Doc to help us take notes, so that if and when we want to make a motion, we can refer to that. So one possible way for us to do it is we can look at the item 3, attachment A, and we can walk through, maybe each part, like start with part A, then part B, and walk through that way. But if my colleagues have other idea or suggestion of what we can do to walk through this in a way that, we're doing it in kind of a logical fashion, so we're not context switching to each other, I'm open to ideas.
Yeah, I concur that we should structure this at the beginning and not just chat. One thing I think maybe we should agree on is that we're not trying to get a motion done tonight. As the city attorney suggested, we might want to talk about things and either tonight or even in the next meeting, give direction as to how to revise it. We hope that this is rarely used, but it's very delicate and we have to get it right. So I'm not thinking that we should even try to get there. The second thing I would like to suggest.
Okay, hold on. Maybe let's just talk about that. Do you have any thoughts about what was just said?
I think we'll know as we go. I think it's likely that we'll have suggestions and we want to see a revised copy and then reconsider that, but perhaps I'm wrong.
Okay, so it's hard to know the future, but I'm generally in alignment with what you're saying, because I do think this is delicate. I think we have to be careful to make sure that council members have freedom to operate. Yet this is not some sort of also retaliatory type thing. So I'm with you on that. So it's kind of complicated for that reason. And so I'm generally aligned to not try to boil the ocean tonight.
Yeah.
So, but what's your second one?
And my second one might sound odd, but we're always trying to figure out sort of what's an outcome, and the outcome of this is to decide, frankly, what censure is, but also what does that mean? If someone gets to the worst case scenario and they're censured, what does that mean? At one point in the earlier draft, and then in the slide here, they say, well, to put a humorous point on it, well, you may have to leave committees. Well, some people might think that's a positive, right? But what does it mean? What does that mean for that person? Are they censured for that time and then they have just like a censure cloud over their head? Or if there are no consequences, does that matter? Does it just no? Are we just worried about someone who wants to be reelected? So it just feels to me like we need to spend the time. I don't know, what is that?
Okay, so maybe I think that's a bigger thing that we can talk about. So maybe can go to click this, like lock that down as a topic here on line 4. And then let's see. Do do you have any thoughts about how we could structure our conversation besides the obvious walking through the proposal from the attorney?
I'm fine to walk through the proposal. Just, there might be a preliminary question or two. I have one preliminary question that's overarching.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and ask questions? And if you have questions too, we can certainly ask questions. And then if there's other topics that we should put onto the list, we could do that too.
Great. All right. Shall I go ahead? Okay, thank you. And thank you to the city attorney and your office for putting this together. It's very what's done next door and down the street and around our region. So I'm curious a little bit about how it was put together and what other folks do, if you have any background on that.
Thank you for that question. I meant to address it and forgot. We did consult with our neighboring cities in the county to see who had censure policies and what they looked like. And many cities do not have any policy. We had policies from, I think, 4 cities, Milpitas,
And they felt there was no alternative, and it was important to do so, and important to maintain the integrity of the council, that we have this mechanism, but it should not be something taken lightly. So thank you.
Actually, I have a follow-on question, which is, so of the 4 cities, what percentage of the total cities looked at is that in terms of have a censure?
we didn't do statistical modeling.
But you looked at other cities. Do you know roughly how many other cities you looked at?
I believe that we surveyed the cities in the county.
Okay, so service, how many cities are there in the county?
13. 16. More than a dozen.
Okay, so maybe like a third roughly. Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
I had another question, maybe address it to all of us, but including the city attorney. Is there any sort of, I won't try to wordsmith this, but is there any sort of more private way that we could bring something to someone's attention? Calling on the carpet a council member is a serious matter, even for something that's serious. And is it, particularly if we're at the correction stage, is it something that a council member could tell the mayor, I think you should talk to council member X? Is that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I would think that that would certainly be either a direct conversation between 2 council members where one had a concern about the other's behavior, or, as you say, through the mayor or through a third party. Absolutely, you should be addressing issues in that type of, what they say when you're a parent or even you're a manager working with employees, the best way to address issues is as soon as possible at the lowest possible level, right? So that the state of the art now in performance evaluation is you don't wait till once a year and then give a bunch of feedback. You kind of do it as you go. So certainly in human relations, that is a way that you should definitely start.
Yeah, I raise that in the context of we're coming up with all these maybe ladder of violations. And we don't necessarily have to say that it has to start with this first one. It could start with a, conversation, stay with my example, a conversation with the mayor to kind of settle it out of court, so to speak, and out of public.
And it isn't necessary to write that down, but if you would like to, we could have an introductory sentence to say council members are encouraged to try to sort out issues and differences, one-on-one or through the mayor to the maximum extent possible, or some such thing.
Well, let's come back to that. I just wanted to get it on the table.
Okay, can the clerk add that to maybe number 5?
May I comment on that? Just quickly, I think that the appropriate response depends on, of course, the nature of the conduct. Sometimes if it's something that you want to deter for future habitual, divergence from protocol that's annoying or insulting or just disruptive, fine. But I think there could be, I wouldn't think so on our council, at least not at present, but you could imagine that something could be said that was so offensive and so outrageous that we might feel the need to make a public comment on it. And we could say it we could say it one by one, or we may feel the need to say it as a body. So I think that to me, that's an outcome that, when you're asking about that, I think addressing it in private is not enough. So
I agree.
Okay.
I wasn't saying that should be required as the first step or anything like that. I was saying as a diffusing mechanism. And the reason I thought about the mayor is that because it's different. If I observe bad behavior on someone, I might want to have a certain person who's in charge of that, who could be the mayor. And the mayor says, we've had a report that you've done this such and such behavior. Can we just chat about that?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it doesn't have to stop there either. You
Yeah.
can go beyond that.
I would hope we would do that as a matter of course, but yes, as the city attorney said, if we wanted to encourage.
Okay. Okay, so maybe what we could do is we could go through the topics listed, plus we could just walk through 8.2, letters A through H, I guess. Okay, so maybe let's just start with, we're on 5 right now. There's 4 and 5, and then A through H. Oh, no, on the screen. Oh, so he's writing down other issues besides the ones listed on this. Yeah. And so if there's other ones you have, we could add them. Okay. So I'll since we're kind of talking about 5, I'll just give my 2 cents here. So I think this would be the right thing to do. I think this is always good practice, whether it's in government or in a private sector. So so I think this is, and also I wonder how much of this stuff has to be codified. Maybe as we heard from the city attorney, like about a third of the cities have it, not that many, and it's not used that often. So I wonder how much of this we have to write down, because we have lots of stuff written down, and it just adds to the complexity of stuff we have to kind of go through. So anyways, that's my thoughts on 5. Maybe we could just try to, since this was kind of kicked off already, talk about number 4 now. So 4, what does it mean to be censured? Committee member allowing you kind of kick it off in terms of what it means to be censured. I don't know if committee member, I think, or you want to comment on that?
Well, I think perhaps my comments are better kept to when we get to it in the document, but there was because the stepped fashion, the one right before it was, what was it, after informal reprimand and resolution of censure. The resolution of censure just talks about sanctions, and if so, I might want a formal reprimand and resolution of censure. And I'm not sure why we're talking about just censure versus the reprimand versus an admonition now, but I think I would rather talk about it as a group, because I think if we get into the weeds, we might see that, for example, I might want to collapse 3 and 4 if possible. And I, ask the city attorney at that point what she's seen, and, so for me, the way I read it here, it's more about sanctions, and I don't know that that's how I think about it. So.
Okay, I think since we're on this thread, let's just talk about H then. We'll start with H. Maybe we'll go backwards. So. H. It's on the attachment A. So this one on 8.2, there's A through H.
Page 309 of the packet.
Yeah, 309 and 310.
Okay, so I'm way up in A. But do you want to skip to that?
Oh, no, I just wanted to talk about, because the issue of censure was brought up. And so I thought we'd just talk about it now, kind of get it addressed, and then just so we keep the thread here. So,
I think Councilmember Baker is saying that she would like to discuss all four of them together to possibly compress them. I'm
yeah,
fine with
so
that.
that's section H.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm
So I was
fine with
saying, let's talk about it now since we're kind of on the topic.
Okay, so some of it sort of keys off of what went before, but let me scroll down there. Yeah, it's hard. So they first come up in wherever it is. And so all my notes about it are up in B, where we talk about processes around admonition, direction to correct, informal reprimand, resolution of censure. I guess for me, let me just talk generally about those four, where they come up in B and G. So when I first read admonition, I thought, why are we doing an admonition? If we think it's significant enough, we should reprimand, and if it's not, it's not. But then later I saw that the reprimand and censure only come after a full hearing, I believe, right? And the admonition does not necessarily need the investigation in the hearing. So I think that is appropriate sometimes not to go through the full process, because we can't forget that while a council member has this hanging over their head, they have it hanging over their head. They're in the news, it's a whole thing. And so this is a pretty detailed process. So at first I was going to suggest we may not need admonition. However, so when we look at things that we don't have to go through the whole rigmarole, I was then nervous because it seemed that without an investigation, I still didn't want to admonish anyone. But there is a chance through this process, if I understand it correctly, that the colleagues memo has to go in, there has to be an opportunity for the subject of the admonition to respond, and then that still comes to council and they get to talk either live or in writing or both. So I'm now back to leaving admonition in. There's more details we can get to at the appropriate point. But the resolution of censure standing alone, unless I'm misunderstanding it, seems to be focused on the sanctions as opposed to the reprimand. And so what I'm wondering is if there's any reason not to have it be a resolution of reprimand and censure, because to me, it's more important what we say necessarily than what we do. And maybe I'm not understanding it right. So maybe I should ask the city attorney if I'm understanding the censure piece.
So a censure resolution is a document with words where the council as a body expresses its views and may state some facts and what the expectations were in law or policy, and its conclusion that the council member's behavior is inappropriate and therefore you are censured. Any additional sanctions after that you would need to get advice on that based on the specific facts, and that would be unlikely. So a typical censure resolution is just words.
Okay,
But
so then
words matter. And as you said, this is a serious situation if it were to occur.
Thank you for that. So I think what would help me would be well, first of all, I might suggest we get rid of the informal reprimand then. Because if it's serious enough to do it, I think we do it. That's sort of I don't know what the informal nature is, but I think if after resolution of censure, it said, formal reprimand, and then picked up the language from above, directed to the subject member of the city council based on a particular action or set of actions that is determined to be in violation of law or city policy, and then just get rid of but is considered insufficient to require formal censure. I think if we're going to do this to somebody and put them through an entire investigation and a hearing, and we're seriously concerned about it, we should censure them. And if not, we should not. So I guess those are my thoughts on the latter, so to speak.
Okay. Do you want to talk a little bit about, you asked the question, what does it mean to be censured? Do you want to kind of drill into that a little bit more?
Yeah, but in the context of what Councilmember Baker just said, I'm very comfortable compressing this to less than 4 because I think of gradations, there's, wait, what's the first one in G? I said 2. What's that?
The admonition.
Maybe I'm missing a page. Oh, sorry.
Right, so they're listed twice in the preliminary process when the topic is first raised and then after a formal hearing. An admonition,
Yeah, I was just missing a page.
yeah, it doesn't require that full evidentiary support, and it really can be a reminder or a warning, and it could apply more broadly to the named individual.
So two things about what, just following up on what you said. I think these can be compressed. I don't think we need 4. And I'm perfectly happy with the reprimand, because if we have 4, then we also have to have kind of, what are the criteria for each of these 4 before we hand them out? This is serious, this is not quite as serious, this is less serious. I just think that's too much gradation. So I mean, I could even be comfortable not forcing this, but I could even be comfortable going as low as 2, where one is an admonition and the other one's a censure, because that's going to make it a lot easier to figure out.
Yeah. Yes, and I think it's important that we haven't talked about yet the direction to correct. I think that's a little bit of a different beast, and I think we should talk about that because there are a lot of these things you can't really correct them. If you've hurled an epithet at someone in public, you can't undo that. But if there are other things you've done, like not recusing yourself on a particular issue and going forward you could, or something, some things are correctable and some are not. So that feels like a different, telling someone to get their act together feels different than saying, and I think that was lousy.
I totally agree.
But you can probably put it in far better words than that. Okay. So I guess that's why I end up with 3. I originally was not excited about the admonition, as I explained earlier, but I think having a lesser thing.
I was going to take out at least 2, at least number 2.
You don't want to have a direction to correct.
Well, I don't think, I mean, I think it's such a different beast that it's kind of obvious that if someone is reprimanded, they also have to correct what they've done, if that's the case.
Well, may we ask staff, do you have examples of that? I was just kind of making it up, but are there instances that you could imagine of what a direction to correct would be aimed at?
So this is where it gets a little difficult, because we're these are what we call hypotheticals, right? Where there's this endless possibilities out there, a parade of horribles. So no, we don't, but it did seem to us, we don't have specific examples, but it did seem to us that this was included in some of the other policies and that it might be a discrete issue that would apply in some cases. I should probably mention that the council as a body can issue a request for some corrective behavior, but whether that correction actually occurs, then gets to the core of an elected official's own behavior and responsibility. And so that's a somewhat of a different issue.
Is that like a jurisdictional thing, or like what we would have the authority to do?
You have the authority to issue the direction. You don't have a mechanism to actually require that occur.
Okay.
In the way that you requested it.
If we were to, since it seems to be sort of a consensus that the number 2 is a little bit of a different beast, but it does seem like it might be handy sometime to be able to direct a colleague to, not do something. I wonder if it could be put in a different section of the handbook without over engineering this. Could we maybe put it in is there another logical place for it so we can take it out of the censure conversation?
So this section, we proposed to call it enforcement. And this is really it would be a new section that doesn't exist now about how all the expectations that are laid out in the procedures and protocols handbook that council members have of each other get enforced. So maybe it belongs in a completely different section of 8.2. but still in this.
The conversation that happened at this committee last December, there was interest in trying to add some language that said if someone is behaving poorly. So there are probably 2 lines, I'll find them during this discussion, that just says rude and inappropriate behavior are not acceptable. So that's sort of scratching the surface. And then obviously this type of procedure is sort of the deep dive into if someone is really acting inappropriately. So that's kind of your spectrum of what is currently in the handbook, which is just be nice, essentially, to if you decide to do something else, what can the council do about that behavior? So the section we reorganized it to is just called enforcement about the handbook itself. And there's not a bunch of pieces in that section, so we could adjust as appropriate.
Okay, so I want to get back to the topic, which was what does it mean to be censured? And I think we heard from the city attorney that basically it's a bunch of words, right? So I think that maybe answers your question in terms of what it could be. Or did you have something more than that?
I think the way this is written is probably correct. And it says may include sanctions, but doesn't state what those are, I think is actually better.
Okay, so maybe I misheard the city attorney. So is censure just words, or because I thought the way our democracy is structured is the elected officials are basically determined by the voters, and the voters, if let's say an elected official performs poorly, doesn't get elected or reelected, and so I thought that's what we were trying to get at. But maybe can you explain a little bit more to the question of to what extent can censure, like what does it mean? Does it mean sanctions, or does it mean just words, as you were saying earlier?
So thank you. So here's what censure does not mean. Censure does not mean that the council can remove a sitting council member from their core council duties. There are only 2 ways in our system that a local elected official can be removed during their term. The first way is by the voters through the recall procedure. And the second way is if a council member, if there were to be a factual basis for believing a council member did not have the qualifications to hold the position in the first place, of which there are, I believe, only 2, age and that you are an elector, which means you are a resident and registered to vote, then you can be removed through the courts, through the quo warranto process. So those are the only 2 ways that someone is removed against their will. Of course, a council member can resign or leave office. So council does not have the ability to prevent a colleague, even one who's behaving very badly, from coming to council meetings, voting, having their vote counted equally with other council members. Currently, under our municipal code, all council members are either on, except the mayor, are either on policy and services or finance. But the other committee assignments, certain liaison assignments, those are more discretionary, and those are really not, going to the core of service. So there might be, depending on the circumstances, a situation in which would be appropriate to make some change there. But otherwise, I think what you're talking about is a public process that involves, the community watching and coming to know about behaviors of concern, and council expressing itself to one of your colleagues.
Okay, does that? So I think. Sorry, did you have something?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both. I think it's important to know it's both the words and the sanction is what censure is. You don't have to do both, but you typically do at least the words. And so an example could be if somebody is saying very racist things, very offensive things, we might entirely inappropriate for you to serve there. So I think, but maybe there isn't a particular action we want to take. So I think that censure is stating the view of the council to the impropriety of that act, plus the possibility of taking action. as described here, removal from a committee or restrictions on city-related travel. That's quite interesting. We don't want you out there representing our city if you're behaving this way. So I think as described here, I'm comfortable with that.
Okay.
I just wanted to air this for our benefit and then council's benefit as to what we're not getting. We're not going to give us, automatically everybody's stripped of committees. This isn't the Congress where that's more actually important, but in terms of the job of the congressperson. So I just want to make sure we were straight with that. And the reason I want to start there is because then that's kind of the worst case scenario. Then back down from there, what are we getting for that? In the eyes of the public or the eyes of the council, if you get a reprimand or what's the one before that, an admonition, the council members know that, but I'm not sure the public does. So are all these gradations going to have enough impact? That's my question for us to discuss.
Tell me more about why you think the public won't know, just because they're not paying attention, because it's going to be public.
It'll be public, but this council member has gotten a formal admonition. This council member has gotten a formal censure. In both cases, it's sort of like, the other council member said they did something wrong.
Yeah, but that's all we have the ability. I think it's important for two reasons. One, what you just said. I mean, to some people, they won't care, and some of their voters won't care. But some people will, and they will hopefully be deterred from the behavior. But it's also important, I think, sometimes for the sayer to say it, for the rest of us to be able to make a public statement that is not okay with us. So I think both things are good reasons for having these available to us. And people will know or they won't, but.
And my only action item that I would suggest is that we don't need 4. That's my only change that I'd make to this.
You don't want to have censure.
I do want to have censure, absolutely.
Isn't that 4?
I'm sorry, 4 items.
Oh,
4 items. 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't think we need 1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay.
I think we can do 1, 2, 3, whatever they are.
It might be easier to just say which numbers you want to keep.
Yeah, 4 is definitely in.
Okay. So I think it's good because we heard from the attorney what is the extent of what can happen and what can't happen. So I think that makes sense. I guess let's put aside 8.2 for a second. And this is more of a question for the city attorney. But I mean, we have freedom of speech in this country. So, I mean, whether we go through this process or not, what's to stop other council members from getting together and just saying, we don't like this person, or we think this person did something wrong? Right? That's a good question. So, yeah. So, I mean, so they're not making a decision, but people sign on to projects all the time saying, oh, I support this, or I don't like this or that. Right. So maybe it's not a formal council action, but people could always do that, right? Council members could always express their freedom of speech, can they not?
So council members do have freedom of speech and a responsibility to represent the people of Palo Alto in the way that council member believes is the most appropriate. So there's not an assurance that there won't be those elements that come into the process. What the policy tries to do is to link this to written requirements that are already in your procedures and protocols, or in state or federal law, or in some other council adopted policy. Mm-hmm. So that it isn't just, as Chair Tanaka said, we don't like this person, that there is a concrete conduct expectation that the council members with the concern can point to that has been violated.
Question. So I have a question for the items that when the issue comes to council, I assume it's subject to public comment.
Yes.
So that's an important thing to keep in mind too. We're providing a forum for the public to weigh in on the propriety or lack thereof of the behavior.
That kind of raises the question of, how much detail do we need to get into besides exactly what you said? is that it's already there in the law or in the procedures. I mean, do we give an example, like, if it were just to make this comment simple, here's what would be an example of something that was subject to censure. Here's something that'd be an example that would be subject to, what's the first one? Admonition.
So my caution there would be that you can't foresee now what the circumstance may be.
Sure.
And what may come to, you're writing a policy for yourselves, but also for future councils and how the world may change. And so I wouldn't, if you try to put too much detail around these things instead of allowing it to be a framework that's flexible, you may find that the council isn't able to do what it thinks is right under the circumstances that appear that were unanticipated.
Yeah, that's why I wouldn't give 15 examples for each one, because then say, well, I've got a 16th example.
Well, I do agree that we should keep something pretty simple, because this is not like it happens every day. This is something that's going to happen once in a blue moon, hopefully.
Right.
And it's not going to be a tool for political purposes, right? It's actually a real problem. Okay, so just trying to see if there's any other discussion we have around what does it mean to be censured. I think we know what it could be. I think, in terms of the removal of committee and restriction from city-related travel privileges, that's really up to the mayor already, right? So if the mayor doesn't like you, you're screwed anyways, right? So
I was just saying, that's already there.
It's already there, right? And then, can people say they don't like people on council? They say that all the time already. So it's not like that's anything new. I think, so I think I have to put this in perspective that a lot of this can be done already, and it's by right of the freedom of speech, right? It's a constitutional thing. So now, can it be a formal action of council? Not, that's what's going to be enabled by this. But I do think that we have to kind of think about, because I do agree with the city attorney, it's hard to foresee everything.
Oh, yeah.
It's going to be really hard. So we got to keep it, I think, in my mind, shorter the better. And also, because I don't think this is hopefully not a thing that's coming up all the time, so I don't think it necessarily needs to occupy I think this thing's like 4 pages now, 3.5 pages, right? So I'm just wondering, wow, for something that doesn't happen very often, it's like awful lot of detail here. I think in the end, the voters decide, right? In terms of who stays, who goes. So anyway, I just kind of have that perspective. And so I think I'm leaning towards keeping this much more lightweight than it is right now. So anyways, that's kind of in terms of what does it mean to be censured. And to the question you were asked about, which is how many of them should there be? I wonder. But I just wonder, like, how much process do we need to have around this? But I don't know. You guys have thoughts?
I have a lot of thoughts. So one, I would hope that none of this relates to whether or not we like somebody or not. It's really about their behavior.
Yeah.
It's not about them. And I think that has to be really clear. And I would be fine putting some preamble, I don't know if it's there already, about how this should not be used for political purposes. And then I have more thoughts, but I'm troubled. I'm distracted by under the notes column there where it says just words. I just don't think that's right for what censure is. It's words and or sanctions.
Well, I think the sanctions, because I think the city attorney was really clear. You cannot remove someone from office, and they're
Right,
either on
it's
the
just-
policy. Oh,
I'm just troubled if this is the
Oh.
public record and it says it's just
so
words.
maybe the clerk can.
That's all. Yeah,
update it,
just that's all. Just
Yeah.
a little thing. Thank
Yeah.
you. Sorry, and now I've lost my own train of thought. Okay, yeah, I do have some general thoughts
Sure,
whenever that's
sure.
appropriate.
Okay,
So
so
I think the train of thought there was how many of these categories do we want? He was saying maybe just one. I was saying maybe just two. And I think you were still back at four. So
I'm not at 4, I'm at 3.
three. Okay. Okay.
I'm at 3. Because I would get rid of number 3. I think that, so one of the things about the admonition is there is less process associated with it.
I like that.
And yes, and I think that sometimes that will be preferable. And
Yes.
other times we will feel like we need to fully investigate it to be able to make a thoughtful and judicious decision. So I like having those 2 options. And then I think the second one, as we talked about, is a different beast, the direction to correct, and might be a useful tool in other circumstances. So that's why I favor sticking with the 3. I do think that, not to add a whole bunch more words, but I have a lot of notes here. I won't bore you all with walking through them right now, but I think there are instances where the investigation would be unnecessary in that even the subject of the what we're saying, allegation might stipulate to the facts. Like if for example, if somebody made a comment at a council meeting, you have 7 witnesses, the same people are going to decide on the censure. It's taped, it's public. We don't need a big investigation to find out what they said, right? So if that's the basis of a censure motion, I would think they would stipulate to what happened and not put themselves through all of that. But I don't know. We could put in things about them waiving it. And or, they might, so even if we were going through the censure, so they might not disagree on the fact that they might not even challenge that they should be censured for it. And so then we're just debating what the sanction is. So, somebody might say, that was a big whoops, go ahead and censure that behavior. I'm going to sit here and take my licks. So there's lots of things like that that could happen.
Yep.
That takes a lot more words. That's a hassle for the city attorney. But I think we need to realize that the process, this could play out a lot of different ways.
Why do we need the words to talk about that?
Because it's not in there and we want to we want to be able to make it shorter. We don't want to have to do a hearing every time if they waive it.
So on the investigation, that's only if needed.
Okay,
And if that's not clear, we could easily clarify
that may
that.
be me.
In many cases, you would not need it.
Yeah, I thought that's what you meant. It would be optional depending on finding evidence or not.
okay. So one thing I was looking at on H here is second line of H. So I mean, if local law, I mean, I would assume the DA would or could prosecute that person like murder, right? That's against the law. I'm sure. I mean, we don't need the people up here to vote like, oh, we should censure that person because they committed murder. They'll be prosecuted, right? So I guess I'm also like, I'm just trying to understand this because it just seems like I look at our policy and procedures and it's quite voluminous already, and I'm just thinking about like if that person violates federal, state, or local law, that there's already a problem, right? I mean, but correct me if I'm wrong. What is I guess it just seems like I'm just trying to understand how that. I mean, because if they did violate, they'll be prosecuted for it, and there'll be jail time or whatever fine that happens to be. So I'm just trying to understand how this works with all that.
So there could be many violations of federal, state, or local law that are not criminal in nature, or even that are, but fall below the thresholds that the district attorney's office would accept for a prosecution. So this is an opportunity, again, to just identify sources of clear requirements that you would link a concern to try to avoid the concern that you identified, which is real, that people can have differences of opinion and that really should not fall into this process. This should be about,
Okay, so so the boundaries of this is that this has to be violating a federal, state, or local law. Okay, so that makes sense. So that's,
or a conduct expectation in the procedures and protocols handbook. And that's actually frankly a trickier area for council because many of the conduct expectations in the handbook are somewhat general in nature. So for example, I'm going to make up the words, but you might have a conduct expectation to, debate your colleagues with respect towards their opinions. And someone can say, well, you violated that with, these following comments. And the other person can say, well, I was simply vigorously advocating for my position. So one person's advocacy is another person's disrespect. And, there's a gradation there. So that's an area that's a little more challenging. And presumably this would not be invoked for that type of thing. That's the type of thing where you have a conversation privately or through the mayor and it's resolved. This is really a last resort. And in cases where I have seen it used around the region or the state, it's been really a longstanding pattern of behavior or very egregious behavior that would cause council to say, we want to take some of our valuable time and our public's attention to deal with this issue through a censure. It really is for very extreme and incorrigible type of conduct.
I wonder whether, and maybe it wasn't, it's late and I'm tired and I forgot, but we should say something along those lines, like beyond just the violations of the policy and protocols handbook that are of such an egregious nature that the council feels compelled to comment or something like that. Just to point out that this is not a run of the mill, that was not friendly on Monday. That and then, and I think sometimes too, that even if it's an act, depending on the specific nature of the behavior, it might be something that is prosecuted and we still feel compelled to speak about it. It's one thing if you embezzled from your clients in your private practice. It's another thing if somehow you embezzled
Necessarily. So,
okay.
Right.
Okay. Okay. Actually, so I think one thing like to ask the clerk is we're spouting off a bunch of ideas. Maybe you could just write some of these ideas down. So one of the ideas from community member Venker was this has to be egregious or something, something significant, not like you were mean on Monday or I forgot what you said. but anyways, I think if you could just catalog the ideas so that when we but yeah.
Well, I think you're at 1, I'm at 2, and Vicky's at 3 right now, so.
Exactly.
Well, so
Which
sounds
may
like
eventually be the way we report at the council.
Well, and I don't think the number is the important thing. I think it's which remedies do we want is the important thing. So if we agree that the informal reprimand is kind of neither hide nor hair and that the resolution of, I would like to rename for formal resolution of formal reprimand and censure or something so that we understand that it's the words and possibly the sanctions. But I would advocate getting rid of number 3 So that we have 3.
Okay. I think that we have consensus on that one. 3 is gone, right? I think.
Yes.
Okay, so I think we're all
got a
good on
thumbs
3.
up from
Okay.
Molly.
I mean, my main thing is to keep this thing as simple as possible because like
Okay.
how many pages right now is our handbook right now? And anyone know? Yeah. "46 pages, right? So this is about 3.5 pages already. So this is, almost 10%. 10% of our handbook is on censure, which is crazy, right? If you think about it. So that's why I'm in favor of trying to simplify it, if we can, because I don't think this is going to occur 10% of the time. At least I hope not. Okay, so on H, is there anything else we should talk about on H before we move on?
Don't think so.
Okay, since B is somewhat related to H, should we go on to B? Would that make sense?
Sure.
Okay, does anyone have thoughts around B?
Yeah.
This is small letter B on 307.
Yeah, sorry.
So just to clarify for council members, this is sort of a preview. These ideas could be raised by the authors of the colleagues memo as a direction that they think might be appropriate. The colleagues memo doesn't have to raise any specific proposal. And some of these can be, the admonition can be addressed just right then with no additional hearing and the matter can be concluded.
So, because, I mean, let's say we didn't do 8.2 at all. I mean, can councilmen not just put together a colleague memo and say, hey, we think that this, you didn't recuse yourself like you're supposed to, so we think that was inappropriate. They could do that already, right? Can they not today?
Yes.
Okay, so, I mean, that's the other thing I'm trying to get also is that, I mean, I'm trying to think what is enabled by this. I mean, because this is hopefully a rare procedure and what is enabled by doing this. So I think, anyways, just wanted to kind of start off with that, but we should.
Well, one of the answers to your questions, I think, question is, we're stating for the public that we have this in place to formally censure people if they don't behave. So,
And it does put a structure around it. And the reason that this was requested by council, so this is not a staff proposal, is because there was a situation at the Valley Water where they had a concern with the behavior of a board member and they did not have a policy. And there was some media about that they felt constrained in some way, I think, from addressing that as a body.
Yeah, and I would suggest that if you are trying to figure out your policy or process at a time of distress, over a particular situation, you will be subject to charges that the two different sides are trying to manipulate that. So I just had a quick little thing on A, if I may, just because it's predicate to this to be. It's just a tiny little thing, but in B, we talk about you may propose, where is it? A new protocol to be included in this handbook. And so what I was wondering is in A, when we talk about a council member's conduct violating federal, state, or local law, this handbook or any other document adopted by council should be this handbook or any new protocol to be included in this handbook?
So I don't think so. So I envisioned a process where some council members say they have a concern about some conduct and a debate ensues about whether there was any rule against that or any clear expectation. I think that's fairly likely, actually.
Yeah.
Because these are going to be sort of messy areas where there's policy differences and people feel strongly about what they're doing. And so I think a fairly likely outcome could be, okay, hey, we won't do any admonitions or censures, but let's make a rule going forward so that it's clear for everybody going forward. And I don't think you would want to try to then apply that rule retroactively. I think you would make that rule to clarify for yourselves and the public what you expect going forward. Does that make sense?
Yes. And I mean, everything you said made sense, but I don't know if that goes then in enforcement, but I don't want to get too hyper technical.
Right. I just wanted to identify that if council finds itself in that situation where you council members do feel a great level of concern about some behavior, but there really isn't a clear conduct expectation that spoke to that before, that you have a pathway to then, you wouldn't proceed through the enforcement, but it's just stated here that you might then start another process to say, hey, we need a rule around that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I'm just being hyper technical about the logic of B, but because I like where you're going with it, that if there's not something expressly on point and one thinks there should be, that then the act is to make something on point. It's just that that's not a colleague's memo about actions inconsistent with federal state, so but we can work that out. Okay, that's helpful because I didn't know if that was intentional or not. Then on B, may I continue on B? Is that all right? So on B1, the admonition, I was confused. I didn't understand a particular sentence. In the middle there, it says, an admonition may be issued in response to a particular alleged action or actions. I'm with you. Although it would not necessarily have to be triggered by such allegations. And I didn't understand that. I'm trying to imagine when it wouldn't be.
Yes, the primary staff attorney on this project is still on vacation tonight. And when I was preparing, I thought, yeah, that's a confusing sentence. I agree with you.
Okay, all right. So we'll get to the bottom of it.
Yeah.
Good.
Yep.
That makes me feel better. All right, then. Okay, so then an admonition may be issued prior to any findings of fact. And because it is a warning or reminder, would not necessarily require an investigation or separate hearings. But in the process that comes later, we talk about still giving that council member an opportunity to put something in the public record in writing or, orally at the time, which is great. So I'm wondering though, if we should, because when I first read it, I went, are we not giving him that opportunity? And we are. So I'm just wondering whether we should say so here. We should expressly state, prior to any findings may be issued by the council prior to any findings of fact regarding allegations, but after an opportunity to respond or something somewhere. That's what I wanted to say earlier. That while this is a lot of words and a lot of process, I think that's the safeguard against misuse, is that if you have the process in place where you're really giving someone a fair chance to, make their own case and defend their behavior. So that was that. We talked about that. I think that's all I have on B.
Okay, do you have anything on B?
No, not other than what I've already commented.
Okay, so for me on
This
B,
question, sorry, go ahead, Mr. Chair.
so on B, yeah, I mean, I just look at the language on B and it looks very similar to like the language on H, right? In terms of the bullets, and I'm just trying to think of like, are both really needed?
Yes, so it is a preview of those items that could be an outcome of a formal hearing. If you want us to look for a way to just reduce the words on the page by collapsing the two, we could try to restructure it to do that.
Yeah, maybe that might make sense. But yeah, I think what would be good, at least in my mind, is that, and I think there seems to be agreement here for this, which is that this is not a tool that's used for trivial things like, oh, I disagree with you Monday, or you were mean, or something like that, but something that's truly egregious, something that is not just a difference of opinion or style or something like that, but it's got to be, I think, a fairly high bar.
that censure is always that.
I don't know if it is. I mean, it depends on what the mechanism is, but I hope it is a high bar, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that. I think we all agree on that it should be a high bar, and that it's not used as a political tool, right? Where let's say as a way to yeah. So, anyways,
I had a related question on that, of what you're bringing up.
sure. Okay, go ahead.
That just popped up because I wanted to ask the city attorney, did you give any thought to having it be more than a majority vote?
Thank you for
Instead of
asking
4 to
that.
3?
One of the our neighboring cities did have a 2/3 requirement, and that is an option. So council could, you can't have less than a majority. So you need at least a majority, but you could have a supermajority.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I think that can make some sense because that would put more restrictions on the politics.
I generally like that direction, so I'm inclined. Actually, so while we're on that topic, do you have any thoughts about that?
I'm literally doing the math. So I'm not texting anyone.
5,
So
basically.
5 is definitely over 2/3. Thank you. I think that's wise for something this serious. It would give, yes, I think that's wise to make it 5.
Okay, so that's something we have consensus on, which is great. Okay, anything else on B that we should talk about? Otherwise, maybe we should go back to A, because we didn't really talk about A that much, but I don't know if is anything else on B. Otherwise, okay, let's go back to A, then we'll try to go in order for the rest. Okay, anyone have thoughts on A?
My thought is it's a good statement of purpose. I'm good with it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's concise enough as well.
I think the only thing and the clerk actually captured already, it's just kind of capturing what the attorney said, which is, it's got to be egregious in nature. So I think, yeah, it seems like you guys generally agree. Okay, good. So I think in A, I think we're good on A. So maybe we should go to C. Okay, any thoughts on C?
Yes, I just had a question. Just process wise. The city clerk will deliver a copy of the colleague's memo to the council member. I'm just curious what deliver means. To their home. Imagine someone knocking on the door and handing it to you, whereas I think, email or I don't know, something else might be
We'll say
appropriate.
provide.
Thank you.
Well, I think the idea behind this is just to make sure that people aren't surprised, like people aren't ambushed, right? And I think that's important, right? Because that would definitely come out, or at least it would strike me as a bit of a political tool then, right? If you're ambushing people, so.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, sorry, I was just taking that as a given. I completely agree with you. I like the fact that you have to very promptly let them know. And that's why, the clerk's office has to receive it by noon so that they can give notice to the council member.
I mean, I would almost say that maybe we should make it more time, right? Not just 11 days. Right? Why? I mean, there's colleague memos that have been sitting around for 6 months, right? That still haven't been heard. So like, I don't know. I think for something like this, especially given the seriousness of it, maybe you should be a lot longer than 11 days, maybe a month. That way there's like little chance that it didn't get seen, right?
I would argue the opposite. Just like we think in our criminal justice system, you want speedy, I'll deliver it speed, because you don't want this thing hanging over your head. I can't imagine in this day and age, we can't get to somebody. And I just, were it me, I would want to deal with it as quickly as possible. And I think 11 days, that's just the standard council cycle. So it doesn't deviate, I think, is the idea.
It is, and I think it also, I think you want to, if this were to occur, hopefully it never does, you don't want your staff to get drawn into it by having a document for a long period of time before it is surfaced.
I actually had a question about staff with regard to C and D. Might be a good time to ask it. It doesn't specifically state that this should be circled back to the city attorney's office. Would you like to look at such a thing before it goes public, so you make sure that all the Ts are crossed and documents are ready?
So we did include that if you're getting as far as considering censure, the attorney should look at that to
Okay.
ensure that that is legally adequate.
Otherwise, it would just be the city manager's office, I guess.
Well, actually, and we may need to check this, but the colleagues memo process in and of itself does involve the at least review or receipt by city manager and city attorney prior to getting on the
Oh, both?
agenda.
Both? Okay.
Yes.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, actually, I thought the colleagues memo goes to all the CAOs, no?
It's the manager and the attorney, and then it goes to the clerk for processing.
Okay.
So again, specifically the colleagues memo process itself, our review is to prepare the resource impact section of a colleagues memo. And in this case, there in all likelihood would be no resource impact. So it would simply be a pass through. But again, that is a part of the process.
And then my office's review is to spot any legal issues with what's proposed.
Okay. 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 Anything else on C? Okay, should we go to D? Okay. Also, it's this one. It's 9:42. So we could go on all night. Like so. I think maybe the proposal that committee member Lowing said was good. Maybe we should just go to 10 o'clock, get as far as you can, and then we can continue to go through the rest of it. Maybe at another time.
Yeah, I would say I'm through 80% of my comments, just a few small minor things left, but so it will probably work out well, yes.
Okay. Okay, great. Okay, so maybe let's go to section D. Do you guys have comments, thoughts about this?
I had one comment on behalf of our city clerk's office. Says if the council member submits written materials, those must be published in a supplemental packet no later than 72 hours before the meeting, but there's no deadline on when they have to be submitted. So I don't know if at least I don't think there is. So do we want to say that the council member, if the council member wants to submit, address the matter in writing, it must be submitted by X time, just like the colleagues memo had to be 11 days by noon. So I'm looking for direction.
Sure, we could add that if you want.
Yeah, I'm just worried that if I'm the accused, a council member, and I bring something over here at, I don't know, 4:50, and you guys are trying to get the packet out, and I don't give you time, and it's disruptive, and you didn't know it was coming. I'm just trying to make it orderly, just like C. I'm just trying to track C in some way, just to give the clerk a few hours cushion in which to publish.
We can add something that does that.
Okay, that's all.
Well, this brings up the question of so let's say whoever the council member happens to be, doesn't submit something before 72 hours. Does that mean that they can't have anything? They can't show a presentation or distribute any document? I think the answer is no. Of course they can, because we do that already. So I can't imagine that for this meeting we couldn't. So I assume this means that because I think that's a freedom of speech. We could always, now whether it goes in packet or not is another story, but I think you could always have documents distributed. I mean, we get distributed documents all the time, right? Assume.
Yes.
Okay, good. So I think as long as that's really clear, I think that's fine. Okay, D? No, okay. E, Okay, any thoughts, comments around E?
No, we'll just conform it to get rid of whichever one it was we didn't like.
Well, I don't know if we have to really hash that out. So that one, I think there's one we have consensus on getting rid of. I think the rest of them, we have to figure out, we're gonna have to, maybe next meeting, we can wrangle over the.
Yeah, we can
the
check
language.
at that in the next draft.
But E, yeah, do you have any thoughts, questions about E?
No.
Okay. Okay, F. Question or thoughts about F?
I think that section has to be there. I hope it doesn't need an investigation, but I think it has to be there.
Now, the question though is, what if it's the mayor or vice mayor? Like, so what happens then?
That's there in the first sentence.
Okay.
In terms of selecting an independent investigator, how do we think we would accomplish that?
Yeah.
I think you would ask me and I would tell you who the good people are.
No, I think it makes sense. We can't have it done in-house. We'll go get one of the good people.
But I guess, how does the city attorney, like, what if it's revolving around the city attorney and maybe another council member? How does that, like, I'm just trying to think of how,
If you could, so good knowledge of who is doing investigations and clearly and objectively and writing good reports is in my office and in HR. So you could either inquire of either place, I think, and we retain folks and review their work and are familiar with who's working in this space that would be most helpful.
are there actually, because I just don't hear about censure stuff very much. Are there actually people out there that just focus on censure? Is that like?
No.
No, okay.
No, and depending, you do read in the paper that there can be issues that are so huge that you actually retain, a whole law firm or a big five accounting firm to come in. But let's not go too far afield.
Okay. Okay, anything else about F? Otherwise, maybe we'll go to G. Okay, comments, thoughts?
Yes, and I have to remind myself. So now this is coming back to council from the ad hoc. And then it says, if the council decides to set the matter for censure hearing, it shall schedule the hearing no sooner than 3 weeks after determination to hear the matter. Does it need to? Why not just, if it's coming back from the ad hoc to council with a recommendation for a hearing, I guess we're saying it's council's option not to hold that hearing, not to accept the recommendation of the ad hoc, because I wish we could condense this piece here, this 3-week piece. It would be nice if we could even do it at that same meeting, but I guess, I don't know. Let me just ask the question. Is there any way we could do it at that same meeting?
So I think you want to provide time for the person whose conduct is at issue to receive the report and prepare.
Well, aren't they going to get it the 11 days before? I mean, they'll have been, presumably, this is not such a detailed, we're not looking at years of behavior. I would think, I guess we could be.
You could be.
Yeah, but if we've been through the whole hearing, the whole investigation process where they've been able to show up and have witnesses, wasn't that all in there? And then the ad hoc, because the ad hoc does a lot of stuff, right, to investigate, works with the investigator. See if I can remember.
So typically when you use an outside investigator, you define the scope of what you are asking that person to find the facts on, and then you let them do that independently. And they come back with a report that you review only for factual inaccuracies. And that can, if it's complex and involves talking to a lot of people or a course of conduct over a period of time, it can take some time. And it can be lengthy. So not necessarily, I mean, this could be fairly straightforward, but so for example, in Valley Water's situation that prompted council to ask for this, I think there was an investigator's report that was very lengthy, that interviewed very, very many people.
Can you reference that and say, schedule the hearing as soon as the investigative report is available, unless the subject council member requests more time, something like that, to
Sure.
put in that kind of flexibility? Because I agree with what Vicky said early on, you know, if this happens, everybody needs this to get over with. You know, not only the subject council member, but the other 6 as well. We need to just have an action item, and it's just hanging out there and it's in the press and all that. So I would think, I was hoping it'd be no later than 3 weeks as opposed to no sooner than 3 weeks. But I understand this takes process.
I think it would be fine to say as soon as possible. And so in our system, that's 11, no, you know, and it takes at least 11 days because that's our standard.
Yeah.
The legal minimum is 3 days. And then you could say unless the subject council member requests additional time.
I like that.
I don't know as I sit here.
I was still on G.
Yeah, it's still in G.
Okay.
G's the last section anyway.
Yeah.
It's a whole page though.
Is it
So
okay if I go to G1?
sure.
Okay, so. Sorry, I'm just keep trying to remind myself what I was thinking from my notes here. All right, so, so this is now that the so there's this, so now we're at the point where the censure resolution is being drafted and submitted, right? And the council member will submit the draft resolution supporting materials. I guess I feel like, I don't, and my instinct could be completely wrong here because you've been going over other people's processes, but I feel as if there should be a proposed censure, what are we calling it? Censure, sorry, I'm losing the, anyway, a supposed censure resolution at the time of the colleagues memo. Like it's almost like a proposed order you attach to a motion. And it could be amended at this point now after post-investigation and all that, but just sort of so we know where we're going. If the colleagues memo is recommending censure, I would think that a proposed censure resolution could be attached initially and not just drafted up now.
So it's possible that if the facts are known to everyone, that could be done, and that the authors of the colleagues memo know that that's what they wish to propose to council. But the authors of the colleagues memo may not know. They may want to open a dialogue about a concern and have a discussion, and they may not know the facts.
Yeah, I was just hoping that we wouldn't bring a colleagues memo about censure unless we felt, unless you had some pretty serious facts you were aware of or believed to be true. And then if it turned out from the investigation they were not, you could withdraw your resolution. And if you found out new ones you wanted to add in, you could amend it at this point. But it sort of forces a focus early on, which I think underscores the seriousness and solemnity with which we want people to take this. But I'm not wedded to that. I just suggest it because it feels like when you do this, you ought to have a pretty good basis. It's sort of like, survive a 12B6 motion. I don't know. It just a thought, because it seems like at this point now, all of a sudden you go, oh, so now what do we want? It's like, well, I feel like we should have gone into this process thinking, this is what I believe. This is what I believe we need to say. Let's investigate and see if our basis is as true as I believe.
Yes, I think it could go that way. There have been situations in which concerns have arisen, say, because of staff complaints or a pattern of staff complaints that are serious on their face, but require factual investigation in order to determine.
I see.
What occurred and to make a knowledgeable and informed judgment. So that really couldn't be done before an investigation.
Because the censure resolution would typically state the factual basis as well as we censure you, blah, blah, blah. But it would, if the recitation of facts would be incomplete or unknown at the time that you make the original colleague's memo, that would be reason not to do it then.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I'm fine with that.
Okay, it's about 9:57. What I recommend we try to do in the last 3 minutes is just, so when this comes back before us next time, I think, of course, we have to kind of try to hash all this stuff out with just some points of agreement, some points of where we have to maybe debate a little bit more. But I think the other thing that would be good is if there's anything that we want to ask staff to have next time, we could maybe ask them now so that we could be maybe in a good place to actually get this all kind of hashed out. So I don't know if you guys have any requests.
I like that. And you will all be shocked to know that I do not have
Okay,
any.
okay.
That was my last point.
Okay. Do you have anything?
I think we kind of did that in the process here.
Okay.
But one thing I might want to do is consider rescinding my good idea of a majority. Because what struck me as we were talking here is that by definition, one of the council members is not going to vote against the censure. So the only thing you could say would be a supermajority of the remaining 6. But it might be just as easy to leave it as a majority of the 7. So
Okay.
we can think about that.
Well, I think we could, maybe we could debate the final points on that and see later.
That's what I'm saying. Just think about it
Yeah,
till
yeah.
the next meeting.
Yeah, but okay, but in terms of, I think I have one ask and maybe staff, I think staff probably has this already, but maybe you could include the links to the other city censure policies. So we can have that for comparison against this one. So it makes it easy for us. So maybe next time around, we can have this, we have everything in front of us. We kind of know, we'll have the minutes for this meeting. But is there anything else that we would want or need? Okay.
So, Mr. Chair, I have pages of notes that I captured this conversation. So I would assume that you would want to see a red line with these changes.
Yeah, if you could, yeah, because I think there's points where we have agreed on, and the ones we agreed on, I think that would be great to have red lines. And then the ones that we have maybe disagreement on, I think would be great to, so it would structure our conversation next time. We could have like, here are the, like, I think we should have 1, we have someone that said 2, someone says 3, right? So we could say, we got to hash that part out. So that would really be helpful. So next time this comes before us, it's all laid out and we could just kind of go through, okay, this one, 1, 2, or 3, which one should it be? Okay, next one. So we could just kind of, do it quickly next time. Okay?
Yeah,
Okay.
prior discussions of this, we usually just put a table and put some options in
Oh,
there.
even
So
better.
it'll be easy to see it without you having to use comment boxes, which makes the text smaller.
That's awesome. Thank you. Okay, guys. I think we are done for today.
Yeah, I just want to thank the city attorney's office, the city attorney and your office for, we had to have that starting point to get to this middle point. So really appreciate that.
You're welcome.
I want to thank all 3 of you for sitting through this because, well, but also it's important because, were it to come to pass, we need the perspectives of all 3 of you. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, guys, I think we're done on this. And so we're on the last part of our agenda, which is future meetings and agendas. I don't know, can you talk about what's coming up and
We have the follow-up on the procedures and protocols, so we will be looking to bring whatever is ready to come back to you. There's also the annual review of the procedures and protocols that has to come to this committee, which is where we solicit to the whole council, asking if there are sections that you all would like to review. So just a heads up that that is coming within the next couple months. Another race and equity update, and
What
those
what
are-
was that?
another race and equity update. I think the last one was June, so it'll be September or October. And we had a legislative recap here, but we're doing that at full council on Monday, so that won't come to committee.
okay, anything else you guys want to talk about in terms of future agenda? And meetings. Any quick thoughts here about how this meeting went? Anything we could do better? Any thoughts? Nope. Yes, no? Okay.
No, I mean, I think we came in with a lot of questions and we don't have as many questions. So I felt like, the three of us were productive.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, no, I think that we had a lot of really good support from staff tonight on all three fronts. And I think it was important. And I appreciate that last night was a long night and that everybody came back to help us tonight.
Yep, definitely. Okay, so we're done with that agenda item, and so we'll call the meeting adjourned. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.